I walked out of a Target into a brutal Detroit winter night and saw my 38-year-old son sleeping in his truck with my two little granddaughters. When I knocked on the frosted glass, he looked at me with broken eyes and said his wife and her father had taken everything, forged his signature, and locked him out of his own home. I did not hug him or offer empty pity. I just looked at him and said, "Tears do not freeze into bullets, son. We are going to fix this tonight." Before I tell you exactly how I systematically dismantled an entire commercial real estate empire to protect my blood, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that nobody messes with family and gets away with it. My name is Darius. I am 75 years old and I know a thing or two about surviving the cold. But that night in mid-January, the Detroit wind was something else entirely. It was -10 degrees outside, the kind of freezing temperature that burns your lungs and turns the moisture in your breath to ice before it even leaves your mouth. I had just walked out of a local Target clutching a small plastic bag with my arthritis medication and some Epsom salts. The parking lot was nearly empty, illuminated only by a few flickering orange street lamps that cast long, lonely shadows across the black ice. I pulled my heavy wool collar up around my neck, eager to get back to the warmth of my 15-year-old Chevy Silverado. I have lived a quiet, modest life for a long time, minding my own business and enjoying my retirement. But as I walked past the darkest corner of the massive parking lot away from the glow of the store entrance, I noticed a familiar shape. It was a black Ford pickup truck. The engine was idling, puffing thick clouds of white exhaust into the freezing night air. I recognized the dent on the rear bumper immediately. It was my son Malik in his truck. A heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. It was past 11 at night. Malik had a beautiful 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, a thriving construction company, and a family. There was absolutely no logical reason for him to be idling in the darkest corner of a retail parking lot in this weather. I changed my direction, my heavy boots crunching against the salt and ice, and walked cautiously toward his vehicle. The windows of the truck were fogged up and coated in a thin layer of frost, but the dim light from a distant street lamp revealed silhouettes inside. I raised my knuckles and tapped firmly on the driver's side window. The shadow inside jolted, startled by the sudden noise. A second later, the glass slowly rolled down, letting out a blast of warm, stale air. I looked inside, and the sight nearly stopped my heart. Malik was sitting in the driver's seat, clutching the steering wheel as if it were a life raft. He looked terrible. His face was unshaven, his eyes were bloodshot and hollow, and deep dark bags hung beneath them. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. He looked completely defeated. But that was not what made the blood freeze in my veins. I peered past him into the back seat. There, huddled together in the tight space, were my two beautiful granddaughters, Nia, who was 8, and Aaliyah, who was just 5. They were fast asleep, wearing their winter coats and shivering underneath two cheap, thin fleece blankets that looked like they had just been bought from the discount aisle inside the store. My granddaughters, the lights of my life, were sleeping in a truck in a freezing parking lot. Malik looked up at me, his voice cracking as he whispered my name. He looked so ashamed, so broken, that he could not even maintain eye contact. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, choking him. I did not yell. I did not ask him what he was doing. I simply asked him, "Why are my girls sleeping in a truck, Malik?" A single tear rolled down his face, a rare sight for a man who had spent his life building houses and working with his hands. He took a deep, shaky breath, and the dam broke. He told me everything. He said his wife, Caroline, and her father, Preston Sterling, had orchestrated a massive, silent takeover of his life. Preston was a wealthy, arrogant commercial real estate broker, a man who always looked down on Malik, masking his racism with fake corporate smiles. Malik explained that he had trusted Preston to help him scale his construction business. Instead, Preston and Caroline had secretly forged his signature on a series of heavy commercial loan documents. They used his impeccable credit to borrow millions, then systematically drained the joint bank accounts and the business accounts dry. But the theft was not even the worst part. When Malik discovered the missing funds that morning and confronted Caroline, she did not apologize. Instead, she executed a plan she and her father had clearly prepared in advance. She called the police, filed a fabricated domestic dispute report, and claimed she feared for her life. Before noon, she had secured a temporary restraining order against him. Using a legal loophole and the corrupt connections her father had in the local courts, they had Malik legally locked out of his own home. They froze his personal cards. He had zero access to his cash, nowhere to go, and was terrified that if he fought back in the moment, the police would arrest him and ruin his chances of ever seeing his daughters again. So he grabbed Nia and Aliyah from school, bought a couple of blankets with the last $50 in his pocket, and hid in the parking lot to keep them warm while he tried to figure out how to survive. They took everything. Dad, Malik sobbed, hitting the steering wheel in pure frustration. Preston told me if I tried to fight the restraining order, he would bury me in legal fees until I was in a homeless shelter. I have nothing left. I stood there in the freezing wind, listening to the son I raised tell me how a greedy, corrupt white-collar broker and a manipulative woman had stripped him of his dignity and his children. Most 75-year-old grandfathers would have panicked. They would have cried with their son, felt helpless, or called the police. But I am not most grandfathers. As I looked at my granddaughters shivering in the back seat, something inside my brain shifted. A very specific, very dangerous switch was flipped. I had spent the last decade playing the role of a quiet, retired African-American man living on a modest pension. Malik thought I was just an old man who used to work a boring government office job. He did not know the truth. He did not know that for 35 years I was a senior forensic investigator for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I spent my entire career hunting down billionaire tax evaders, dismantling offshore shell companies, and destroying corrupt men just like Preston Sterling. They looked at my son and saw an easy target. They had no idea they just woke up a ghost. Malik wiped his face, apologizing for dragging the girls into this mess, telling me he just needed a few days to figure out a lawyer and a loan. I did not let him finish his sentence. I reached through the window and put my hand on his shoulder. My grip was firm, grounding him, pulling him out of his spiral of despair. "Tears do not freeze into bullets, son," I said, my voice as cold and sharp as the Detroit wind. "Crying in a parking lot will not get your company back, and it certainly will not keep my granddaughters warm. We are going to fix this tonight." Malik looked at me confused by the absolute lack of panic in my voice. "Get out of this truck," I commanded. "Wrap the girls up in those blankets and carry them to my Chevy. You are coming to my house. We are not hiding and we are not begging for mercy." I watched my son carefully unbuckle his sleeping daughters and lift them into his arms, carrying them through the snow to my old battered car. I looked back at his empty truck, then stared out into the dark city. Preston Sterling and his daughter thought they had executed the perfect crime. They thought they could steal a black man's empire and leave him freezing in the dark. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about power. The war had officially begun. The next morning brought a fragile kind of peace to my modest Detroit home. The harsh winter sun barely pierced through the frosted window panes of my kitchen. Inside, the smell of warm maple syrup and buttermilk pancakes filled the air. My granddaughters Nia and Aliyah sat at the small wooden dining table, their laughter ringing out as they covered their plates in syrup. For a brief moment, the horrors of the previous night in that freezing Target parking lot seemed like a bad dream. Malik stood by the stove nursing a cup of black coffee. He had showered and borrowed some of my old clothes, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. He watched his daughters with a look of pure, desperate love, trying to shield them from the reality of their stolen lives. I was just pouring myself a cup of coffee when the illusion of safety shattered. It started as a heavy, authoritative pounding on my front door. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor. It was the aggressive, commanding strike of law enforcement. The heavy thuds echoed through the quiet house, making 5-year-old Aliyah jump and drop her fork. Malik froze, the color draining from his face completely. He knew even before I walked down the hallway that the nightmare had followed him here. I approached the door and peered through the peephole. Standing on my porch were 2 uniformed sheriff deputies, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. Behind them, parked illegally across my driveway, was a gleaming, brand-new white luxury SUV. My stomach tightened into a hard knot. I opened the door slowly, stepping out onto the porch to shield the view of my house. "Good morning, gentlemen," I said, keeping my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "How can I help you today?" The taller deputy stepped forward, holding a thick manila folder. "Are you Darius, and is Malik present on the premises?" he asked, his tone strictly business. Before I could even answer, Malik stepped out onto the porch behind me. The moment he did, the rear-tinted window of the luxury SUV rolled down. Sitting in the back seat, wrapped in an expensive designer winter coat, was Caroline. Her face was set in a smug, cold expression that made my blood boil. She did not look like a mother concerned for her children. She looked like a predator who had just trapped her prey. Mr. Malik, the deputy, said, handing him the thick stack of papers. You are being served with an emergency ex parte custody order signed by a family court judge this morning. By order of the court, you are required to surrender immediate physical custody of the minors Nia and Aaliyah to their mother, Caroline Sterling. Malik looked at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. He shook his head, stepping back. No, you do not understand, he pleaded, his voice breaking. She stole my company. She locked me out of my house. She left us in the cold. You cannot take my girls. The deputy's expression hardened. Sir, we are not here to debate the merits of the case. The judge signed the order based on sworn affidavits claiming financial abandonment, erratic behavior, and child endangerment. If you do not comply right now, you will be arrested for violating a court order and things will get much worse for you. Inside the house, the girls heard the commotion. Nia and Aaliyah ran to the door, clinging to Malik and crying, Daddy, who are these men? Nia cried, her little hands gripping his jeans. Caroline finally stepped out of her warm SUV, her designer boots clicking against the icy pavement. Come here, girls, she commanded, her voice sharp and devoid of warmth. Your father is not well. You are coming with Mommy. The girls screamed, burying their faces into Malik. Malik looked at me, tears streaming down his face, completely paralyzed by the legal threat. If he fought the police, he would be thrown in jail, giving Caroline exactly what she wanted. I placed a firm hand on his shoulder, squeezing it hard. Let them go, Malik, I whispered, my voice dangerously calm. Do not give them a reason to put you in handcuffs. Do not fight the badge. Malik broke down sobbing as he peeled his daughter's fingers from his clothes. He kissed their foreheads, promising them he would see them soon. Caroline grabbed their arms, roughly pulling them toward her vehicle without a single ounce of maternal comfort. She shot Malik a look of pure, unadulterated contempt, got into her SUV, and drove away, leaving my son a hollow, broken shell on my frozen porch. We walked back into the house, the silence left behind by the girls feeling heavier than the winter air outside. Malik collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. Before either of us could say a word, his cell phone on the coffee table began to ring. The caller ID flashed a name that made my jaw clench. Preston Sterling, Caroline's father, the architect of this entire destruction. Malik stared at the phone, too devastated to even reach for it. I picked it up, swiped the screen, and pressed the phone to my ear. I did not say a word. I just listened. Well, 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 Preston's voice boomed through the speaker, dripping with arrogance and victory. I hope you enjoyed your little morning wake-up call, Malik. Let this be a lesson to you. When you try to play in the big leagues, you get crushed. My daughter has the kids, she has the house, and I have your company. I kept my breathing steady, remaining absolutely silent. Preston let out a harsh, mocking laugh, realizing Malik was not the one holding the phone. Oh, is this the old man? Preston sneered, his tone shifting to something deeply condescending and blatantly racist. Listen to me very carefully, Darius. Handing over the kids was just step one. A retired factory worker living on a fixed pension cannot fight my lawyers. You people need to learn to know your place. Keep your son on a tight leash, or I will make sure he ends up in a cell. Do not ever try to cross me. I did not yell. I did not curse. I simply lowered the phone from my ear and pressed the end call button, cutting off his arrogant laughter. I tossed the phone back onto the coffee table. Malik was hyperventilating, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He was spiraling into a full-blown panic attack, gripping his hair and rocking back and forth. They took them, Dad, he choked out between sobs. They took my girls. They took my business. I have no money for a lawyer. I have no house. They forged everything perfectly. Preston owns half the judges in this city. I lost. It is over. I lost my children forever. I looked at my son, witnessing a strong, hard-working man reduced to absolute despair by a system built to protect rich, corrupt men like Preston Sterling. I walked over to the front door and slowly turned the deadbolt, locking the world out. I closed the blinds, plunging the living room into shadows. Stop crying, Malik, I said, my voice resonating with an authority he had never heard from me before. I told you last night, tears do not freeze into bullets. Preston Sterling thinks he just won the war because he holds a piece of paper signed by a bought judge. He thinks he is fighting a broke, helpless old man. Stand up, I commanded. Malik looked up at me, bewildered by my sudden shift in demeanor. I did not look like his tired, retired father anymore. I walked past him, heading down the hallway toward the back of the house, leading him to my dusty, cluttered study. The room was filled with old cardboard boxes, outdated encyclopedias, and a heavy mahogany bookshelf that had not been moved in a decade. "Help me push this," I ordered. Malik, confused but compliant, pushed against the heavy wood. As the bookshelf slid to the side, it revealed a blank section of the wall. I reached out and pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner disguised as a light switch cover. A soft beep echoed in the quiet room, and a massive reinforced steel wall safe slid open. Malik gasped, stepping back in shock. Inside the safe were stacks of encrypted hard drives, a secure military-grade laptop, and thick dossiers of financial records. "You think I just worked in a boring government office all my life?" I said, pulling the encrypted laptop from the safe and setting it on the desk. For 35 years, I was a senior forensic investigator for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I spent my life hunting down billionaire tax evaders, dismantling cartels, and destroying corrupt men just like Preston Sterling. I retired with a $12 million blind trust. Preston thinks he is playing chess against a pawn. He has no idea he just challenged the king. The heavy steel door of the wall safe glided open with a quiet, mechanical hum that felt completely out of place in my old, dusty study. Malik stood frozen in the center of the room. His tear-streaked face was illuminated by the sudden blue glow of the keypad. He watched in absolute silence as I reached into the dark cavity of the hidden vault. I did not pull out old photo albums or a rusty hunting rifle. Instead, I retrieved a sleek, matte black military-grade laptop. I set it gently on my scratched oak desk. Next, I pulled out 3 encrypted solid-state hard drives, each encased in heavy, shockproof rubber. Then came a leather-bound ledger filled with access codes and secure network keys. Malik took a step back as if the desk had suddenly caught fire. He looked from the high-tech equipment to my face and back again. For 38 years, my son had known me as a man who wore faded flannel shirts, who drank cheap coffee on the front porch, and who supposedly retired from a tedious, low-level government desk job. He had seen me as a simple man living on a fixed pension, a man who needed his son to sometimes help him navigate modern technology. But the man standing before him now, systematically connecting encrypted drives to a machine that cost more than a luxury car, was a complete stranger to him. "Dad, what is all this?" Malik finally whispered, his voice trembling. He wiped the remnants of tears from his cheeks. His mind was struggling to process how his elderly father possessed equipment that looked like it belonged in a federal intelligence briefing room. I did not smile, and I did not try to comfort his confusion. I simply plugged in the final drive and opened the laptop screen. I looked Malik dead in the eye and decided it was finally time to drop the disguise I had worn for decades. "I told you before, son, that I worked in a government office." That was technically true, but it was the biggest lie of omission I ever told you. I did not shuffle papers, and I did not stamp tax returns. For 35 years, I was a senior forensic investigator for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Malik stared at me, his mouth slightly open, unable to form a single word. I continued, speaking, my voice steady and cold. "While you were growing up, going to school, and building your construction business, I was dismantling international money laundering rings. I hunted corrupt billionaires, greedy politicians, and cartel accountants. I tracked phantom money across borders and tore down financial empires built on lies. People like Preston Sterling and his daughter are not new to me. They are exactly the kind of arrogant, white-collar predators I spent my entire life putting in federal prison." Malik shook his head slowly. "But the house," he stammered. "The way we live. You let me think you were struggling. Why would you hide this from me?" I placed my hands flat on the desk. "Because wealth makes men soft, Malik. If you had known I retired with a $12 million blind trust funded by whistleblower rewards and high-level consulting, you never would have built your own empire. You would have relied on my safety net. You needed to build your own calluses. You needed to learn the value of a dollar earned with your own blood and sweat. And you did exactly that. You built a legitimate, thriving company from the ground up. I was so proud of you that I swore I would never touch that money unless it was a matter of life or death. Now Preston and Caroline have decided to take what you built and throw my granddaughters into the freezing cold. They looked at my gray hair and my old Chevy and assumed I was a helpless victim. They made a fatal miscalculation. I am giving you the artillery to defend your bloodline right now." I pressed my thumb against the fingerprint reader on the laptop. The screen flashed green, and a complex operating system booted up. "Let us go hunting," I said. The screen came alive with streams of data illuminating the dark corners of my study. I flexed my fingers, feeling a familiar rush of adrenaline that I had not felt since my active duty days. The digital world is a vast ocean, and men like Preston Sterling always believe they are swimming in deep water where no one can see them. They think their expensive lawyers and complicated contracts make them invisible. But money always leaves a footprint. It leaves a digital shadow that can never be fully erased if you know exactly where to look. I bypassed the standard public search engines entirely. Tapping into secure databases I still had access to through my old network, I pulled up the public commercial real estate records for Detroit and the surrounding counties. I typed in the name Preston Sterling and watched as the system generated a massive web of business entities. Preston was smart enough not to put everything under his own name. He used a maze of limited liability companies, shell corporations, and holding trusts. But it was nothing I had not dismantled 100 times before. Malik stood behind my chair, leaning over my shoulder as lines of text and property deeds scrolled rapidly across the monitor. I opened a backdoor protocol into the county tax assessment portal, cross-referencing it with state corporate registry filings. I isolated the holding company that had fraudulently absorbed Malik's construction business just 24 hours ago. There it is, I murmured, pointing to a newly registered entity on the screen. Caroline and Preston transferred your assets here, but they are moving the cash too fast. They are not hiding it for long-term growth. They are liquidating it immediately. Malik frowned, leaning closer to the screen. Why would they liquidate my heavy machinery and commercial accounts so fast? They are losing money on those quick sales. I did not answer right away. My eyes scanned the transfer destinations. I began to track the outgoing wire transfers from that shell company, following the digital breadcrumbs they were desperately leaving behind. The procedural hunt was pure instinct. I followed the money trail as it bounced from the Detroit shell company to a corporate account in Delaware. From Delaware, the funds were wired to an offshore holding account in the Cayman Islands. Preston thought this complex routing would wash the money clean, making it impossible for a local family court judge or a bankrupt son-in-law to ever find it. But he was fighting a ghost who wrote the manual on financial tracking. I pulled up the offshore routing numbers and cross-referenced them with global debt registries. The picture began to form with crystal clarity. Preston was not a billionaire real estate mogul. He was an illusion. I opened up the escrow accounts tied to his largest commercial properties. They were empty. The luxury high-rises he claimed to own were leveraged to the absolute limit. He was using new investor money to pay off the interest on old toxic loans. Malik watched the screen, his breathing heavy as he realized the magnitude of what we were looking at. "Dad, what are all these red flags on his main portfolio?" Malik asked, pointing to a flashing column of numbers on the right side of the monitor. "Those are default notices," I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I kept digging deeper, pulling up the private debt ledgers. I found the ticking time bomb hidden beneath layers of fake corporate filings. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. I leaned back in my chair, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. "Preston Sterling is completely broke," I said, breaking the heavy silence in the room. Malik stared at me in shock. "Broke," Malik repeated. "But he lives in a $10 million mansion. He drives a Bentley. He is a fraud," I explained, pointing to the massive balloon payment scheduled on the screen. "His entire empire is a crumbling Ponzi scheme. He has a $10 million commercial loan coming due in exactly 14 days. If he does not pay it, the federal government will audit his companies and he goes to federal prison for wire fraud. He did not steal your company because he is a greedy billionaire, Malik. He stole your company because he is a desperate drowning man gasping for air. He needed your cash to pay off dangerous creditors and keep his illusion alive for just one more month." The sheer, pathetic reality of Preston's actions hung in the air. The arrogant man who called me a retired factory worker was nothing but a beggar in a tailored suit. I closed the main ledger file and opened a blank corporate drafting document. "He thinks he won the war," I said softly, "but he just bled into shark-infested waters. Now we buy his soul." The air inside the Wayne County Family Courthouse felt just as sterile and freezing as the Detroit winter outside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pale glow over the heavy oak benches and the polished marble floors. I sat in the back row of the gallery, my posture rigid, my face completely devoid of any emotion. I watched the heavy wooden double doors swing open at the back of the room. In walked Preston Sterling and my daughter-in-law, Caroline. They did not just enter the room, they swaggered into it, exuding an aura of arrogant, untouchable wealth. Preston wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair slicked back perfectly, radiating the fake confidence of a man who believed his money could bend reality. Caroline walked beside him, her chin tilted high, a smug expression painted across her face. They were flanked by a team of 4 highly paid corporate lawyers, men in $3,000 suits holding thick leather briefcases. These were the kind of legal mercenaries who charged $1,000 an hour just to clear their throats. Malik sat at the defense table next to a cheap, exhausted public defender who looked completely out of his depth. The hearing commenced, and the legal circus began immediately. Preston's lead attorney stepped forward, unzipping a massive binder. With a smooth, rehearsed cadence, he presented a mountain of forged documents to the court. He slid fabricated bank statements across the mahogany table, claiming they were undeniable proof of my son's secret life. The lawyer spun a masterful web of lies, accusing Malik of funneling his construction company's capital into illegal underground gambling syndicates. He painted Malik as a dangerous, desperate addict who had squandered his family's future. I watched the attorney wave the forged transfer receipts. The documents looked flawless, engineered by professionals paid to destroy lives. Malik shook his head in absolute disbelief, his hands trembling as he stared at the fabricated evidence of crimes he never committed. The man sitting high above us on the judicial bench was Judge Harrison. I had spent 35 years investigating financial networks, and it only took me one glance to know exactly who this man was. He was a creature of the country club, a man who undoubtedly shared golf carts and expensive scotch with Preston Sterling on the weekends. Judge Harrison barely even glanced at the frantic, desperate defense. Malik's overwhelmed lawyer tried to mount. He did not ask for third-party verification of the bank statements. He did not order an independent forensic audit of the gambling claims. He treated the fraudulent papers as absolute, unshakable gospel truth. The entire proceeding was a meticulously choreographed theater meant to legitimize a robbery. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses, peered down his nose at my son, and delivered the final blow. He slammed his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. The loud crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. The judge formally granted temporary sole physical and legal custody of Nia and Aaliyah to Caroline, effective immediately. He cited Malik's fabricated financial instability and the falsified domestic threat as his primary justification. But the corruption did not end there. Knowing full well that Malik had been locked out of his own bank accounts and his business illegally seized, Judge Harrison ruthlessly ordered my son to pay an astronomical amount of monthly child support. It was a calculated financial death sentence designed to ensure Malik would violate the court order within 30 days, giving them the legal excuse to throw him in a jail cell. The system was not broken. It was working exactly as Preston had paid for it to work. The injustice of the moment was a suffocating physical weight. Malik could not take it. The realization that his daughters were being legally ripped away from him by a corrupt system broke the last remaining shred of his composure. He snapped. He kicked his heavy wooden chair backward, sending it crashing loudly to the marble floor. Malik lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the defense table, and screamed at the judge. He pointed a shaking finger directly at Preston Sterling, yelling that the man was a thief, a liar, and a predator who had stolen his company. The sterile quiet of the courtroom shattered into immediate chaos. The judge banged his gavel, furiously demanding order. 2 heavy-set courtroom bailiffs stationed near the walls instantly reacted to the sudden movement. I saw their hands drop swiftly to their utility belts, their fingers unbuckling the holsters of their tasers and firearms. The situation was fractions of a second away from escalating into a violent arrest. If Malik took one more step toward that bench, he would be tackled, charged with assaulting an officer, and permanently stripped of his parental rights. I did not shout. I moved. For a 75-year-old man, I crossed the gallery barrier with a terrifying silent speed forged from decades of fieldwork. Before the bailiffs could draw their weapons, I reached Malik's side. I clamped my right hand onto his shoulder and gripped his leather belt with my left, pulling him backward and downward with crushing mechanical force. I forced him back into his seat, pinning him there so he could not move an inch. I leaned in close to his ear, my voice a cold, deadly whisper that cut straight through his blinding rage. "Silence," I commanded. "Let them think they have won today. If you strike that man right now, you lose the girls forever. Swallow your pride and sit down." Malik gasped for air, his chest heaving, but he stopped resisting. The bailiffs relaxed their grips on their weapons, stepping back slowly. We walked out of the courtroom into the harsh, blinding, fluorescent light of the courthouse hallway. The air felt heavy with defeat. Standing near the elevators waiting for us was Caroline. She was surrounded by her wall of expensive lawyers, but she stepped forward to make sure Malik saw her face. She gave him a wicked, triumphant smirk that curled the edges of her lips into a cruel sneer. She leaned in just close enough for her toxic words to reach his ears alone. "You are never going to see Nia and Aaliyah again," she whispered, her voice dripping with venom. "You are nothing now." Malik tightened his fists, his knuckles turning white, but he remembered my warning and kept his mouth shut. I did not engage in her petty theatrical bickering. My eyes were not on her arrogant smile. As a trained forensic investigator, my eyes automatically scanned her for physical assets. That was when I saw it. Resting heavily on her left wrist, peeking out from beneath the cuff of her designer coat, was a massive, blindingly expensive diamond watch. I recognized the brand and the cut instantly. It was a custom timepiece easily worth $50,000. I knew her financial profile from the audit I ran last night. Caroline had no personal income, and Preston's legitimate accounts were drained. She could never afford that watch. It was bought with stolen money, heavily financed by the credit she had illegally extracted using my son's identity. It was the perfect, fatal mistake. We pushed through the heavy glass doors of the courthouse and stepped back out into the freezing, brutal Detroit winter air. The biting wind felt like a relief after the suffocating corruption inside. We walked in complete silence across the icy pavement until we reached the sanctuary of my battered 15-year-old Chevy Silverado. The moment the heavy truck doors slammed shut, enclosing us in the quiet cabin, the adrenaline left Malik's body. He slammed his fists against the dashboard, his broad shoulders shaking as he began to sob in pure, absolute frustration. "They took them, Dad," he wept, hitting the steering wheel again. "They bought the judge. They bought the law. We cannot beat that kind of money." I did not offer empty comfort. I reached inside the breast pocket of my heavy wool coat and pulled out a sleek, dark leather checkbook tied to my hidden offshore trust. I clicked my pen and calmly wrote out a certified check for $2 million. I tore the thick paper from the ledger and held it out in front of his tear-streaked face. Malik stared at the amount, his breath catching in his throat. "Go hire the most ruthless federal family lawyer in the state of Michigan," I told him, my voice steady and cold as the ice on the windshield. "Stop crying over spilled milk. You handle the custody battle. Leave the rest to me. I am going to buy Preston Sterling's soul." The house was completely silent except for the low hum of the heating vent and the faint rhythmic tapping of a thumb against a smartphone screen. Malik sat slumped on the edge of the living room sofa, swallowed by the heavy, dark shadows of the late evening. The pale blue light from his phone illuminated his exhausted face, highlighting the deep lines of grief and stress etched around his tired eyes. He was staring at a calculated illusion. He was obsessively scrolling through Caroline's public social media feed, torturing his own soul with every swipe. She had posted a new series of photos just an hour ago. The location tag proudly declared they were at an exclusive 5-star luxury ski resort in Aspen, Colorado. There was a picture of Caroline holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne, her wrist casually displaying that same massive diamond watch I had spotted at the courthouse. But the photo that truly shattered Malik was the next one. It was a picture of Nia and Aaliyah smiling brightly in the deep snow, bundled up in brand-new designer ski jackets and custom-fitted snow boots that cost more than a monthly mortgage payment. Caroline had captioned the photo, "Living our best lives, finally free and happy." Malik let out a broken, ragged breath. His broad shoulders shook as he stared at the screen, feeling the crushing, unbearable weight of a father who believed he had failed his children. He looked at the ridiculous luxury on the screen and wondered how he could ever compete with that kind of money when he had been brutally stripped of everything he owned. I stood in the doorway of the living room, quietly watching my son poison his own mind with her digital lies. I walked over and gently took the phone from his trembling hands. I looked at the bright screen and studied the photographs with the cold detachment of a seasoned investigator. People who boast are always sloppy. Their arrogance makes them careless, and their desperate need to show off always leaves a traceable digital trail. I did not offer my son any hollow words of comfort. Instead, I told him to follow me into the study. I placed his phone on my scratched oak desk right next to my encrypted military-grade laptop. I woke the system up, feeling the familiar hum of the processor beneath my fingertips. I ran a secure data extraction protocol, pulling the raw image files directly from the social media servers. I stripped away the superficial filters and exposed the underlying metadata hidden within the code. The hidden data tags gave me the exact geographical coordinates, the precise time the photos were captured, and the specific mobile network Caroline was using to upload her fabricated reality. But I did not stop there. I knew her father, Preston Sterling, was completely broke. His real estate empire was a sinking ship drowning in massive hidden debt. He did not have the liquid cash to send his daughter and my granddaughters on a spontaneous luxury vacation to Aspen. The money had to be coming from somewhere else. I accessed a secured federal portal through heavily encrypted servers to pull a comprehensive tri-bureau credit report under Malik's social security number. The results populated on my screen in a matter of seconds, flashing with urgent red warning indicators. I leaned in closer, my eyes narrowing at the digital ledger. In the past 48 hours alone, 3 brand new top-tier platinum credit cards had been successfully opened using Malik's stolen identity. She bypassed the fraud alerts by routing the digital applications through the primary internet protocol address of the construction company she had just stolen. She had already maxed out 2 of the cards with astronomical charges. The billing statements showed first-class airline tickets for 3 people to Colorado, a massive deposit at a 5-star ski resort, and a $50,000 charge at an exclusive jewelry boutique in downtown Detroit. I pointed to the glowing screen showing the irrefutable evidence to my son. "She is not spending her father's wealth, Malik," I said, my voice low and steady. "She is spending your future. She stole your identity to fund her victory lap." This was a monumental shift in the battlefield. What started as a bitter divorce and a corrupt family court dispute had just escalated into a completely different realm of the justice system. Caroline had crossed a very dangerous line. This was no longer just a messy civil matter governed by a bribed local judge. This was aggravated identity theft and credit card fraud. Because she used those fraudulently obtained financial instruments to purchase airline tickets and cross state lines into Colorado, it was now officially a federal felony. She had unwittingly stepped out of the protective shadow of her father's local political connections and walked directly into federal jurisdiction where his bribes meant absolutely nothing. I meticulously documented every single digital footprint she left behind. I locked in the exact internet protocol addresses used for the credit applications, cross-referencing them with the server logs from the airline and the ski resort. I captured the digital signatures, the precise timestamps, and the geographic data points tying her personal cellular device directly to the fraudulent transactions. I secured the chain of custody for the digital evidence, creating a flawless, unshakable timeline of her criminal activities. My hands moved across the keyboard with practiced, lethal precision. For 35 years, I had built airtight federal indictments that sent extremely wealthy and powerful people to maximum security prisons. Building a case against a sloppy, arrogant 35-year-old woman was effortless. Every click of my mouse cemented another brick in the wall of her inevitable prosecution. I saved the compiled data into an encrypted standalone file, meticulously formatting it according to the strict evidentiary standards required by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Caroline thought she was celebrating a flawless victory over a broken man. She had no idea she was actually digging her own grave with a stolen platinum card. I turned to Malik and explained the severe gravity of what we were looking at. The local family court judge might be able to ignore forged business documents, I told him, but federal prosecutors do not look away from interstate wire fraud and identity theft. The moment she boarded that flight, she triggered federal sentencing guidelines. "We are not just going to take your daughters back. We are going to ensure she faces the full, devastating weight of the United States justice system." Malik stood silently behind my chair, staring blankly at the glowing lines of data cascading across the monitor. The profound reality of the situation washed over him in a cold, heavy wave. He had spent the last decade of his life building a home, a thriving business, and a family with a woman he genuinely believed loved him. He had trusted her completely, sharing his dreams, his fears, and his passwords. But the woman he thought he married never actually existed. Caroline was nothing more than a highly efficient financial parasite. She was a weapon carefully trained and deployed by her corrupt father, Preston Sterling. They had likely targeted Malik from the very beginning, seeing his growing construction company and impeccable credit history as the perfect host to feed their failing empire. The betrayal ran deeper than blood, but as Malik processed the undeniable proof on the screen, something fundamental shifted inside him. The tears he had shed in the freezing parking lot finally stopped. The crushing, suffocating sadness that had paralyzed him was entirely consumed by a sudden chilling realization. He no longer saw the mother of his children. He saw a ruthless criminal who was perfectly willing to destroy his life and traumatize his daughters just to maintain her illusion of wealth. His posture straightened, and his expression hardened into a mask of pure cold detachment. The grief evaporated, leaving behind a hardened resolve. He finally saw Caroline with absolute clarity, not as a lost love, but as an enemy who had to be permanently neutralized to protect his children. I pressed a command on the keyboard, sending the compiled encrypted dossier to the heavy-duty laser printer resting on the corner of my desk. The machine hummed to life, its internal gears grinding as it began to churn out page after page of irrefutable condemning evidence. The rhythmic printing sound filled the quiet study, an industrial heartbeat, keeping time with our silent, absolute focus. It took several minutes for the printer to finish its task. When it finally stopped, a massive 500-page stack of paper sat waiting in the output tray. It was a complete, comprehensive federal indictment, perfectly bound and ready for delivery. I picked up the thick, heavy stack of documents and dropped it onto the center of my wooden desk with a loud, resonant thud. The sound echoed through the room like the slamming of a prison door. I placed my hand flat on the top page, looking from the damning evidence directly into my son's hardened eyes. "Caroline thought she was running away with your life," I said, my voice low and completely devoid of mercy. But her arrogance made her blind. She just handed us the keys to her own jail cell. The study was completely quiet except for the steady clicking of my keyboard. Malik was asleep on the guest bed, finally finding a few hours of rest after the nightmare of the past 2 days. I remained at my desk, staring into the bright screen of my secure laptop. I had spent 35 years hunting men who thought they were smarter than the system. Preston Sterling was no different. He projected the image of a wealthy, untouchable real estate tycoon, but his digital footprint told a story of absolute desperation. I routed my connection through a secure server and began pulling the commercial mortgage-backed securities tied to his name. The deeper I dug, the more fragile his empire appeared. He was running a classic shell game, moving money from one failing commercial property to pay the interest on another. But a shell game only works until the music stops. I cross-referenced his private escrow accounts with public foreclosure notices, and that was when I found it. The ticking time bomb. Buried deep within a maze of subsidiary holdings was a massive commercial loan he had taken out 3 years ago. The terms of that loan required a $10 million balloon payment due in exactly 14 days. Preston did not have $10 million. He did not even have $1 million in liquid cash. That was exactly why he had targeted my son and stolen his thriving construction company. Preston needed Malik's clean assets to leverage a new line of credit. But even with Malik's stolen company, Preston was still falling drastically short. Furthermore, he had used fabricated financial statements to secure the original loan. If he defaulted in 14 days, the bank would trigger an automatic federal audit. That audit would instantly expose his forged documents, turning a simple bankruptcy into a massive federal wire fraud case. Preston was not just facing financial ruin. He was staring down the barrel of a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. He was a drowning man gasping for air. All I needed to do was throw him an anvil disguised as a life preserver. I picked up my encrypted mobile phone and dialed a number I had not used since my retirement. The area code was Washington, District of Columbia. The man who answered on the second ring was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless and discreet corporate law firms on the East Coast. We had worked together years ago when I needed to untangle offshore accounts for the Treasury Department. He owed me a massive favor, and it was time to collect. "I need to establish a ghost entity," I told him, my voice low and authoritative. "I need a Delaware limited liability company fully insulated with nominee directors and layered corporate veils. Absolutely no paper trail leading back to me or my trust. Make it look like a highly aggressive private equity firm that specializes in distressed commercial real estate. We will call it Apex Holdings." The lawyer did not ask any unnecessary questions. He knew better than to pry into my business. Within 3 hours, he had executed the filings, expedited the registrations, and established a fully functional corporate shell. Apex Holdings was now a legally recognized entity, complete with a sleek corporate website, a virtual office address in a high-end financial district, and a dedicated team of proxy negotiators who answered only to me. My identity was completely shielded behind impenetrable layers of attorney-client privilege and corporate anonymity. I transferred $10 million from my blind trust into the newly established Apex Holdings escrow account. The money sat there pristine and ready to be deployed as the ultimate weapon. Preston Sterling was accustomed to dealing with local banks and easily manipulated regional investors. He had absolutely no idea how to defend himself against a phantom hedge fund armed with unlimited capital and zero mercy. I instructed the legal team to prepare a very specific type of lending agreement. This was not a standard commercial loan. It was a financial bear trap. We were going to offer Preston exactly what he needed to avoid federal prison. We were going to dangle the $10 million right in front of his desperate, greedy eyes. But to get the money, he would have to sign away his soul to a ghost he could never see. The strategy was simple but devastatingly effective. Predators like Preston are driven entirely by their own arrogance. They believe they are the smartest people in the room, and they assume that anonymous corporate entities are just faceless machines they can easily manipulate. I had my proxy representatives at Apex Holdings initiate contact with Preston's primary holding company. They sent a highly formal, unsolicited proposal expressing interest in offering emergency liquidity to distressed commercial portfolios. The email was crafted to sound perfectly detached, calculating, and entirely focused on high-yield returns. We presented Apex Holdings as a newly formed equity group looking to aggressively expand our footprint in the Detroit commercial market. We explicitly mentioned that we were willing to overlook current cash flow problems in exchange for heavily secured asset collateral. It was the exact miracle Preston was praying for. Less than an hour after the initial email was sent, Preston's chief financial officer replied. They were trying to play it cool, pretending that they were simply exploring new financial partnerships, but their rapid response time screamed pure desperation. They requested an immediate virtual meeting to discuss the parameters of a potential capital injection. I sat in my quiet study listening to the audio feed of the negotiation while my proxy lawyers did the talking. Preston sounded exhausted, but he tried to maintain his arrogant facade. He pitched his failing properties as prime real estate and casually mentioned my son's stolen construction company as a highly profitable subsidiary. He asked for a $10 million bridge loan, claiming it was just to smooth out a temporary seasonal cash flow issue. My proxies, playing their roles perfectly, agreed to the loan amount without hesitation. They did not argue about the valuation or question his blatantly inflated revenue projections. They simply agreed to provide the $10 million in liquid cash within 48 hours. I could hear the audible sigh of relief escaping Preston's lips over the phone line. He thought he had just conned a group of naive, out-of-state investors. He had no idea he was dancing directly into the slaughterhouse. The bait was taken, but the trap still needed to be armed. My proxy lawyers sent over the official term sheet for the $10 million loan. The conditions were absolutely brutal, designed to be a financial death sentence. In exchange for the rapid, unrestricted cash injection, Apex Holdings required total cross-collateralization. Preston had to pledge his entire commercial real estate portfolio as security, but that was not enough. The contract explicitly demanded that he also put up his personal luxury mansion and the complete ownership shares of my son's stolen construction company. Every single asset tied to the Sterling family name was bundled into the collateral agreement. The repayment terms were incredibly strict, featuring an astronomical interest rate and a zero-tolerance default clause. If Preston missed a single payment, or if any of his financial disclosures were found to be fraudulent, Apex Holdings claimed the immediate and uncontested right to seize all collateral. There would be no grace periods, no renegotiations, and absolutely no drawn-out bankruptcy protections available to him. The contract contained a strict waiver of legal defense, meaning that upon default, ownership of his entire life would transfer instantly to my holding company. It was a brilliantly poisoned chalice waiting for him to drink. I reviewed the final draft of the contract on my laptop, making sure every legal snare was perfectly hidden within the dense corporate terminology. The document was an absolute masterpiece of financial destruction. I took a slow, deep breath and pressed the return key, sending the encrypted final agreement directly to Preston's inbox. I sat back in my chair and watched the digital delivery confirmation flash across the screen. I knew Preston would not send this to his own legal team for a thorough review because he simply could not afford to wait. He needed the money today to avoid the federal wire fraud audit that would lock him in a cage. Less than 10 minutes later, my screen illuminated with a new notification. Preston Sterling had digitally signed the agreement. He swallowed the hook, line, and sinker. Preston Sterling thought he had just saved his crumbling empire when he signed the loan documents with the anonymous Delaware company and the $10 million hit his accounts. He paid off his most dangerous creditors and took a deep breath of relief. But his victory was short-lived and his sense of security began to rot from the inside out. The next morning, his legal team received a massive stack of discovery motions from a top-tier federal family lawyer representing my son Malik. The lawyer Malik hired using my $2 million check was a legal shark who did not play by local county rules and who could not be intimidated. This lawyer demanded full forensic audits of Preston and Caroline and their hostile construction company takeover. Preston realized he was losing his grip on the narrative, and his illusion of absolute control was fading. The local judge he had bribed could not stop a federal attorney from digging into their hidden financial records. Preston felt his arrogance turning into a suffocating paranoia. He was a man who used his wealth to bully people into submission, and when the money stopped working, he resorted to the only other tactic he knew. He decided to use brute physical intimidation. He wanted to break Malik's spirit so completely that my son would drop the custody battle and run away in absolute fear. He wanted to remind the retired factory worker and his broke son that they were messing with a man who had dangerous connections in the Detroit underworld. Preston made a quiet, untraceable phone call to some men who did not exist on any official payroll. He ordered them to send a very loud and very violent message to my front door. It was 2 a.m, and the Detroit winter wind was howling through the bare trees outside my house. The temperature had dropped well below zero, freezing the snow into solid blocks of ice and turning the streets into a desolate wasteland. Inside the house, everything was perfectly still. I was resting in my bedroom with the light sleep of a man who spent 35 years hunting predators. Suddenly, the heavy, dead silence of the night was brutally shattered. The explosive sound of breaking glass echoed down the quiet suburban street. It was not just one window breaking. It was a repetitive, violent, smashing sound followed by the heavy, sickening thud of metal hitting metal. I sat up immediately, my senses fully alert. I did not turn on the bedside lamp or make a single sound. I moved through the dark hallway with the silent precision of a ghost. I looked through the front window blinds and saw 2 large men dressed in dark winter coats and black ski masks. They were standing in my driveway wielding heavy aluminum baseball bats. They were methodically destroying Malik's Ford pickup truck. One thug swung his bat with all his strength, shattering the windshield into thousands of tiny glittering pieces of safety glass that scattered across the frozen driveway. The other man was smashing the headlights, tearing off the side mirrors and caving in the doors, leaving deep, jagged dents in the metal body of the truck. They moved with the hurried, chaotic energy of hired muscle, wanting to cause maximum damage in minimum time. After completely destroying the vehicle, one of the masked men jogged up the frozen steps of my front porch. He pulled a thick piece of paper from his pocket and took out a heavy steel hammer. With 3 loud, aggressive strikes, he nailed the paper directly into the wood of my front door. The men then sprinted down the icy driveway, jumped into a dark, unmarked sedan, and sped away into the freezing night, their tires spinning wildly on the snow. The entire attack lasted less than 2 minutes, but the message was meant to leave a lasting psychological scar. They wanted us to feel vulnerable, exposed, and hunted in our own home. The loud smashing and the heavy hammering on the front door had jolted Malik awake. He came running out of the guest bedroom wearing his sweatpants, his eyes wide with confusion and panic. When he saw the flashing amber lights of a distant street lamp illuminating the total destruction of his truck, his confusion instantly morphed into a blinding, uncontrollable rage. That truck was the very last piece of his old life. It was the vehicle he used to build his construction business from the ground up, working long, brutal hours to provide for his daughters. Malik let out a guttural scream of pure, raw fury. He turned around and grabbed a heavy wooden baseball bat that I kept near the coat rack in the hallway. He unlocked the deadbolt and prepared to charge out into the freezing night, ready to chase down the men who had just threatened our family. He wanted to inflict pain. But before he could throw the door open, I stepped directly into his path, blocking his exit. I grabbed his forearm with a terrifying strength, forcing him to stop in his tracks. Malik struggled against me, his chest heaving as he breathed heavily. He told me to let him go so he could kill them. I did not raise my voice. I looked directly into his angry eyes and told him to drop the bat immediately. I told him that running out into the dark like a wild animal was exactly what Preston Sterling wanted him to do. Preston wanted him to get arrested for assault so Caroline could use it against him in family court to prove he was a violent and unstable father. I told Malik that true power is remaining perfectly calm when your enemy expects you to break. Malik stared at me, his breathing slowing down as my cold logic penetrated his blinding rage. He slowly lowered the wooden bat, letting it slip from his fingers and fall heavily to the floor. I opened the front door and pulled the piece of paper that the thug had nailed to the wood. I brought it inside and turned on the hallway light. The note was written in thick black marker. It was a vile, threatening message filled with disgusting racist slurs telling us to drop the custody case and leave Detroit, or the next time the bats would be used on our heads. Malik read the note and his jaw clenched in renewed anger. He told me we needed to call the local police immediately to report the hate crime and the extreme vandalism. I shook my head and folded the note carefully, placing it on the table. I told Malik that calling the local police was a complete waste of time. Preston Sterling had half the local precinct in his pocket and commanded too much local influence. If we called the local cops, the report would simply disappear into a filing cabinet and the thugs would never be found. Instead, I told Malik to follow me into my study. I locked the door behind us and booted up my secure laptop. I had never trusted neighborhood watch programs or basic home security systems. When I moved into this house, I installed custom military-grade security cameras completely hidden inside the rain gutters and the porch lights. I opened the surveillance software and pulled up the raw video files from the past 10 minutes. The screen displayed pristine 4,000-pixel resolution night vision footage. The image was so incredibly sharp that the darkness of the winter night looked as clear as day. We watched the video of the two men destroying the truck. My cameras had perfectly captured the license plate of their dark sedan as they drove away. But more importantly, the camera hidden above the porch had captured the face of the man who nailed the note to the door when his ski mask slipped down for just a fraction of a second. I paused the video and zoomed in on the man's face. I ran his image through a facial recognition database linked to my federal network. Within seconds, his criminal record populated on the screen, showing his direct payroll connections to Preston's real estate firm. Malik looked at the screen in absolute shock. He realized that we had irrefutable digital proof tying his wealthy father-in-law directly to a violent hate crime and property destruction. Malik told me again that we had to give this to the police right now. I looked at my son and smiled a cold, dangerous smile. I told him that local police handle local problems, but we were going to drop a massive federal hammer on Preston's head. I picked up my mobile phone and dialed a highly secure direct line to Washington District of Columbia. I waited as the line connected, ringing only once before a familiar voice answered the call. I did not say hello or offer any pleasantries. I simply said, "Director, I have a very clear-cut case of violent witness tampering, interstate extortion, and a federally classified hate crime ready for your Detroit field office." I told the director I had pristine video evidence tying a major commercial real estate broker to hired muscle who just attacked my property. The voice on the other end of the line asked me to send the encrypted files immediately so they could begin building the federal indictment. I hung up the phone and looked at Malik. Preston Sterling thought he was sending a terrifying message by breaking some glass and leaving a racist note. He did not know he just signed his own federal arrest warrant. I sat in the dim light of my study, holding the encrypted mobile phone to my ear. The secure line hummed for only a fraction of a second before a familiar voice answered on the other end. It was Arthur, a current director at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in the Financial Crimes Division. We had worked together closely during my final years at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, taking down offshore money launderers and corrupt politicians. I did not waste time with pleasantries or small talk. "Arthur," I said, keeping my voice low and completely steady, "I have a live situation in Detroit that requires your immediate attention. Preston Sterling has officially crossed the line from corporate fraud into violent federal crimes." I told him exactly what had transpired in my driveway just moments ago. I detailed how Preston had hired local thugs to destroy my son's truck and nail a racist, threatening letter to my front door. Arthur listened quietly, his silence a testament to his absolute focus. When I finished explaining the attack, I hit the send key on my secure laptop. The encrypted file containing the pristine 4,000-pixel night vision footage, the facial recognition identification of the hired muscle, and the direct payroll link back to Preston's holding company vanished into the federal database. I have just uploaded the video and the digital paper trail I told him. You can clearly see the face of the perpetrator, and you will find his direct financial ties to Preston's commercial real estate firm. This is no longer just a white-collar wire fraud case. This is interstate extortion, witness tampering, and a federally classified hate crime. Arthur reviewed the incoming files and let out a low whistle. "You really know how to build an airtight cage, Darius," he said, his voice laced with grim satisfaction. "I am adding these charges to the active federal file we have been building since you flagged his offshore accounts last week. We have him dead to rights on the Ponzi scheme, but this violent escalation gives us the leverage to launch a full-scale raid. Do not alert the local authorities," Arthur warned me. Local cops might leak the investigation to Preston's political connections. I assured him that I had absolutely no intention of involving the local precinct. We were building a guillotine, and Preston was going to walk right into it completely blind. The brutal Detroit morning arrived with a pale gray sky and a biting wind that cut straight to the bone. The temperature was still well below zero, but the work had to be done. Malik and I stood in the driveway, dressed in thick winter coats, holding heavy push brooms and metal dustpans. The shattered remains of his truck windows covered the frozen concrete like a blanket of glittering crushed diamonds. We worked together in complete, absolute silence. There was no anger left in my son's movements. The blind rage that had consumed him the night before had been entirely replaced by a cold, calculating discipline. He swept the jagged shards of safety glass into neat piles, his breath pluming in the freezing air. I watched him work, feeling a deep sense of pride. He was no longer the broken man crying in a dark parking lot. He was a man preparing for war. We did not hire a cleaning crew or ask for help from the neighbors. We cleaned up the mess ourselves because handling your own destruction is the first step to rebuilding your empire. The physical labor was a necessary grounding exercise. It kept our minds sharp and our emotions perfectly contained. Every sweep of the broom was a silent promise that Preston Sterling was going to pay for exactly what he had done. When the driveway was finally clear of the dangerous debris, Malik gathered the heavy trash bags and tossed them into the dumpster. He looked at the battered remains of his truck, the vehicle he had used to build his stolen construction company. He did not shed a single tear. He simply turned around and followed me back into the warmth of the house, ready for the next phase of our counterattack. Back inside the house, the heating vents hummed, providing a sharp contrast to the bitter cold outside. I walked over to the wooden cabinet in the living room and pulled out a bottle of 20-year-old aged bourbon. I grabbed 2 heavy crystal glasses and poured a generous measure of the dark amber liquid into each. I handed one glass to Malik and gestured for him to sit down on the worn leather sofa. He took the glass, his calloused hands wrapping around the crystal, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The strong liquor burned a path down our throats, thawing the winter chill from the inside out. We sat in silence for a long moment, letting the quiet morning settle around us. Finally, Malik looked up from his glass, his dark eyes searching my face for answers. "Dad," he began, his voice soft but heavy with years of unspoken questions. "Why did you hide the money all my life? We struggled. You worked long shifts and drove that old rusted Chevy. You let me think we were barely scraping by. Why did you not tell me we were rich?" I took a slow sip of my bourbon, letting the rich flavor linger before I answered. I looked directly into his eyes and told him the absolute truth. "Because wealth makes men soft, Malik." I said, my voice steady and resolute. "If you had grown up knowing there was a $12 million safety net waiting for you in a blind trust, you never would have built your own construction company. You would have become lazy, entitled, and weak. You would have been exactly like Caroline and her corrupt father. I needed you to struggle. I needed you to know what it feels like to work a 16-hour shift and wake up with aching muscles. I needed you to build your own calluses because those calluses are what build character." Malik listened intently, absorbing every single word. "You built an empire with your own 2 hands. I continued, leaning forward. "You became a strong, independent man and a loving father to Nia and Aaliyah. You earned every ounce of your success, and no one can ever take that knowledge away from you. Preston Sterling thought he could break you by stealing your bank accounts because he thinks a man's worth is measured by his wallet. He does not understand that true power comes from resilience." I paused and took another sip of bourbon. "I kept my wealth a secret to protect your drive and your spirit. But now that the foundation is poured and your enemies are trying to burn your house down, the rules have changed. You built an empire, son. Now I am giving you the heavy artillery to defend it." Malik nodded slowly, letting the profound weight of my words settle deep into his mind. He looked down at his calloused hands, finally understanding the greatest gift I had ever given him was the opportunity to be his own man. Just as a comfortable silence fell between us, a sharp mechanical buzz interrupted the peace. Malik's cellular phone vibrated aggressively on the coffee table. He reached over and picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the screen. It was a multimedia text message from Caroline. She had not bothered to ask about his well-being or inquire if he was safe after her father sent armed thugs to destroy his property. Instead, she had sent a high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of an ornate gold-embossed envelope resting on a marble countertop. Inside the envelope was a glossy, exclusive VIP access ticket for the highly anticipated annual Sterling Charity Gala being held that very evening at the luxurious Ritz-Carlton Hotel in downtown Detroit. It was the premier social event of the season, packed with wealthy investors, corrupt politicians, and the city's elite. Caroline was flaunting her stolen luxury, rubbing her perceived victory directly in his face. Beneath the photograph of the glittering VIP ticket, Caroline had typed a short, venomous message intended to completely crush Malik's spirit. The text read, "This is where the real men are tonight. Stay in your lane, you broke loser." Malik stared at the glowing screen, his jaw clenching tight as the sheer arrogance of her words washed over him. He slowly turned the phone around and showed the mocking message to me. I looked at the photograph of the golden ticket and read her cruel insult. I did not get angry. I did not shout. I simply leaned back against the leather sofa and let a cold, dangerous smirk spread across my face. Caroline thought she was humiliating a defeated man. She had no idea she had just sent us an engraved invitation to her own absolute destruction. I finished the last drop of my bourbon and set the crystal glass down. "Get ready, son," I whispered. "We are crashing a party." The sudden vibration of the mobile phone on the kitchen counter shattered the quiet discipline of the morning. Malik had just finished reading the mocking text message about the charity gala when another notification illuminated the screen. It was a new message from Caroline. She was not gloating this time. The tone of her message was deceptively businesslike. She demanded that Malik meet her alone at a high-end coffee shop in Birmingham, an affluent upscale suburb located 20 miles outside of Detroit. She claimed she wanted to negotiate a private settlement before things got incredibly ugly in the family court system. She insisted that he must come completely alone. If he brought a lawyer or if he brought his father, she promised the deal would be instantly off the table and he would never see his daughters Nia and Aaliyah again. Malik stared at the glowing screen, feeling a familiar surge of anger rising in his chest. He slowly turned the phone around and showed the message to me. I read the text and immediately recognized the psychological tactic she was deploying. It was classic extortion. Caroline wanted to corner him while she believed he was entirely vulnerable, exhausted, and severely sleep-deprived. She calculated that the terrifying events of the previous night, the smashed truck windows and the freezing cold, had successfully broken his spirit. She was trying to close the trap and force a legal surrender before he could realize he possessed any real power. I looked at my son and told him that we were going to use her supreme arrogance against her. I was not going to let my son walk into a hostile negotiation completely blind and unprotected. I left the kitchen and returned to my dusty study, stepping up to the biometric wall safe one more time. I bypassed the heavily encrypted hard drives and reached into a small velvet-lined compartment at the very back of the steel vault. I pulled out a tiny, sophisticated piece of surveillance equipment. It was a federal-grade micro-recorder no larger than a standard shirt button, designed to capture crystal-clear audio in crowded, noisy environments. I walked back into the living room and carefully attached the tiny black device to the inside collar of Malik's heavy winter jacket, hiding it perfectly within the thick fabric seam. I looked Malik directly in the eyes and gave him highly specific operational instructions. I told him he had to completely swallow his pride. He had to walk into that coffee shop and act like a man who had been utterly defeated by the world. He needed to slump his shoulders, lower his voice, and act desperately afraid of losing his children. I warned him that he could not show even a single fraction of anger. Anger would make Caroline defensive and cautious. Desperation, on the other hand, would feed her massive ego and make her incredibly arrogant. And extreme arrogance always leads to careless, voluntary confessions. Malik nodded slowly, his face transforming into a mask of cold, absolute discipline. He took the keys to my battered 15-year-old Chevy and drove toward the wealthy suburb. He parked 2 blocks away from the upscale cafe, stepping out into the freezing wind, feeling the tiny recording device resting silently against his collarbone, ready to capture every word. The upscale coffee shop was filled with wealthy suburbanites sipping overpriced lattes and discussing their winter vacations. Caroline sat alone at a secluded corner table looking absolutely flawless. She wore a tailored designer winter coat and her wrist heavily displayed the massive $50,000 diamond watch she had bought with stolen funds. Malik walked over and sat across from her, intentionally slouching his broad shoulders and keeping his eyes fixed nervously on the marble table. Caroline did not offer him a drink or bother with any polite greetings. She immediately unzipped her designer handbag and slid a thick, dense legal document across the smooth table surface. She leaned forward and laid out her brutal, uncompromising terms. She told Malik that if he signed away all of his remaining equity and intellectual property rights to his construction company permanently, she would convince her father to drop the fabricated financial abandonment charges. In exchange for his total surrender, she would graciously allow him supervised visitation with Nia and Aaliyah for 2 hours every other weekend. Malik played the role of the devastated father flawlessly. He let out a shaky breath and asked her softly how she could do something so evil to him after 10 years of marriage. Caroline scoffed, rolling her eyes at his emotional display. She leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, completely confident in her absolute power over him. She openly admitted that her father, Preston Sterling, had planned the entire hostile takeover of his business months ago. She explained that Preston desperately needed a clean, profitable company to absorb his massive hidden debts, and that Malik was just a convenient, disposable stepping stone. She laughed quietly about how incredibly easy it had been to forge his signature on the commercial loan documents because he had trusted her so blindly. She boasted that the local family court judge was a close personal friend of her father who would do whatever Preston asked him to do. She told Malik he had absolutely no way out of this trap and that signing the extortion papers was his one and only chance to ever hold his daughters again. Malik felt a blinding, white-hot rage burning deep inside his chest, but he remembered my strict instructions. He kept his head bowed, playing the broken, defeated husband to absolute perfection. He even managed to let a single tear slide down his cheek, mastering the undercover performance. He looked at the heavy legal document and then looked up at Caroline, asking her softly how she could afford her sudden, lavish new lifestyle. He mentioned the luxury ski trip to Aspen and pointed to the massive diamond watch sparkling on her wrist. He kept his voice trembling and weak, asking her how she paid for all of it when he knew the company accounts were frozen. Caroline smiled a cruel, wicked smile that illuminated her true nature. She proudly admitted that she had used his social security number to open 3 elite platinum credit cards behind his back. She mocked him openly, stating that his impeccable credit score was the only useful thing he had left to offer her. She confessed to the massive identity theft loudly and clearly, totally unaware that the federal-grade micro-recorder hidden inside his collar was capturing every single syllable of her federal crimes in pristine high-definition audio. She tapped her manicured nails impatiently against the legal contract and demanded that he pick up the pen and sign away his life. Malik looked down at the thick stack of extortion papers resting on the marble table. He did not pick up the pen. Instead, he simply stood up from his chair, his posture suddenly shifting from a defeated, broken victim to a man in total, absolute control. He looked down at Caroline, whose smug expression suddenly faltered as she grew confused by his abrupt change in physical demeanor. He calmly told her that he would have his lawyer review the paperwork, and then he turned and walked out of the coffee shop without looking back. He left her sitting there alone with her worthless, illegal contract. He walked down the freezing suburban street and got into the passenger seat of the parked Chevy where I was waiting patiently. Malik unclipped the tiny black device from his collar and handed it directly to me. He looked straight ahead at the frosted windshield and breathed out a cloud of cold winter air. We have her. I sat in my study watching the digital clock on my monitor tick down. Across the city, Preston Sterling was locked inside his corner office at his commercial real estate firm. I had hacked into his internal communication servers earlier that morning, and I could see the digital logs of his incoming calls. His private lines were lighting up constantly. Angry investors were demanding their quarterly returns. Panicked bank managers were leaving urgent voicemails about his overdue loan payments. The illusion of the great Preston Sterling was completely shattering behind closed doors. I knew exactly how he looked in that moment. The expensive, custom-tailored Italian suit he wore to project absolute power was probably soaked in cold, nervous sweat. He was a man drowning in a very deep and very dark ocean of his own making. The $10 million balloon payment was due in less than 48 hours, and if he missed it, the federal government would immediately audit his fraudulent books. His entire Ponzi scheme would be exposed to the world, and he would spend the rest of his life eating off a metal tray in a federal prison. He had stolen my son's construction company, hoping to liquidate its assets to cover his massive debts, but he had severely miscalculated the timeline. He was still millions of dollars short. He stared at his computer screen, his heart pounding against his ribs. The walls of his glass office felt like they were closing in on him. Every time his desk phone rang, he flinched. He was completely out of options, out of time, and out of friends. Sitting right in front of him on his expansive mahogany desk was his only lifeline. It was a digital contract from a mysterious Delaware-based investment firm called Apex Holdings, offering him exactly $10 million in liquid cash. He did not know that Apex Holdings was a ghost entity created by me. He just saw a miracle. He had to take the money. I picked up my secure encrypted mobile phone and routed the connection through 3 different proxy servers to ensure the location could never be traced back to my Detroit home. I activated a sophisticated voice-altering software program I had downloaded onto my laptop. I tested it briefly, listening to my own voice transform into the deep mechanical and ruthlessly cold tone of a highly aggressive corporate hedge fund manager. I dialed the direct number to Preston's private office. He answered on the very first ring, his voice breathless and frantic. He stated his name, trying desperately to sound authoritative and in control. I did not introduce myself or offer any professional pleasantries. I spoke with the icy precision of a predator closing its jaws. I told him I represent the directors of Apex Holdings. I explained that we had reviewed his distressed commercial portfolio and had transmitted the final loan documents to his inbox. I told him we were prepared to wire $10 million into his primary holding account within 30 minutes of his signature. However, I made it clear that our capital was in high demand. I told him he had exactly 5 minutes to execute this contract, or we would withdraw the offer permanently and pursue other investment opportunities. Preston stuttered, his breathing heavy and erratic over the phone line. He pleaded with me, his arrogant facade completely crumbling. He said he appreciated the swift capital injection, but argued that our collateral terms were completely unprecedented. He complained that we were asking him to cross-collateralize his entire real estate portfolio, his personal private residence, and the newly acquired construction subsidiary. He panicked because we were demanding immediate absolute forfeiture of all assets upon a single missed payment with absolutely no grace periods. He begged to negotiate these default triggers. I cut him off sharply, my artificial voice booming with absolute zero mercy. I told him Apex Holdings does not negotiate. I reminded him that we were providing a $10 million emergency rescue to a man who was clearly bleeding to death. I said we absorb the massive risk of his failing cash flow, and in return we demand absolute total security. I told him if he was confident in his ability to generate revenue, then the collateral terms should not frighten him. I ordered him to hang up the phone right now and explain his financial situation to his angry investors if he could not stomach the terms. I told him the clock was ticking and he had 3 minutes left. I let the heavy, oppressive silence hang on the line, knowing that the sheer psychological pressure was crushing his lungs. He was trapped in a corner of his own making. I could hear muffled voices in the background through the phone speaker. Preston had placed his end of the call on a brief hold, but my surveillance access to his office network allowed me to listen to the room audio perfectly. He was frantically arguing with his own corporate attorney. The lawyer sounded terrified, pleading with Preston to step away from the keyboard. The lawyer urged him not to sign, warning him that this was not a standard commercial loan, but a financial suicide pact. The attorney explained that this Apex Holdings group operated like a predatory cartel. He warned Preston that signing the waiver of legal defense meant literally handing them the keys to his entire life. The lawyer emphasized that if Preston defaulted by even $1 single or 1 single day, the holding company could legally seize his home, his cars, and his businesses without a single court hearing. He begged Preston to look for another way, but Preston was blinded by his own massive ego and his suffocating desperation. I listened to him snap at his lawyer, his voice dripping with his trademark arrogance. He hissed angrily that there was no other way. He yelled that he needed that $10 million to clear the balloon payment and keep the federal agents off his back. He laughed bitterly, asking his lawyer if he truly believed a mastermind like him would let some faceless corporate hedge fund take his empire. Preston bragged that he had been playing this game for 30 years. He explained his flawed master plan, stating that once the cash cleared his accounts and the federal audit was canceled, he would simply restructure all the holding companies. He boasted that if Apex Holdings tried to seize the collateral later, he would drag them into a messy, drawn-out bankruptcy court battle for a decade. He genuinely believed he knew how to manipulate the legal system better than anyone else. He actually believed he was smarter than the contract. He believed his local political connections and his history of corrupt legal maneuvering would protect him from a faceless corporate entity. He was terribly wrong. Bankruptcy court could not protect him from this specific contract because I had meticulously structured it to bypass civil litigation entirely through a strict binding arbitration clause triggered by any evidence of federal wire fraud. Preston took the phone off hold. His voice returned to the line, trying to project a hollow, false bravado. He told me that Apex Holdings drives a very hard bargain, but agreed that we had a deal. He proudly announced that he was executing the document right now. I sat in my quiet study, my eyes locked onto the glowing screen of my military-grade laptop. I watched the digital document tracking software refresh in real time. I could clearly imagine Preston sitting at his grand mahogany desk, his hand trembling slightly as he used his computer mouse to navigate to the bottom of the dense 50-page legal contract. He clicked the electronic signature box, typing out his full legal name. The digital ink sealed his ultimate fate. The screen on my laptop flashed a bright, vibrant green. A loud, distinct notification chime echoed through my quiet study, breaking the heavy silence. The words "Document completed" appeared in bold letters across the center of my monitor. The encrypted server instantly verified his digital signature, locking the contract into the secure legal registry. The transaction was absolute binding and perfectly legal. The $10 million transfer was automatically initiated from my blind trust, satisfying his immediate debt, but simultaneously closing the steel jaws of the ultimate trap. I reached out and ended the phone call, cutting the connection without saying another word. The silence in my study was profound and incredibly satisfying. I looked at the finalized contract on my screen, reading the name Preston Sterling, authorized and bound. It was finally over. He thought he had outsmarted a faceless corporation to save his fraudulent empire. He had absolutely no idea that he had just signed his entire life away to the very man he had openly mocked and discarded. I now officially, legally, and indisputably held the premier lien on every single asset the Sterling family possessed. I owned his commercial properties. I owned his luxury mansion. I owned the construction company he had stolen from my son. I reached out and slowly closed the laptop, the screen going black. I sat back in my chair, feeling a cold, absolute calm wash over me. The trap was fully set, and it was finally time to spring it. The morning of the Sterling Charity Gala arrived with a heavy gray sky over Detroit. Inside my house, the air was perfectly still. It was the deep quiet that always precedes a devastating storm. I sat alone at my heavy oak desk, bathed in the pale glow of my computer monitor. Today was not about planning anymore. Today was about execution. I spent the early hours of the morning meticulously organizing the weapons we would carry into the ballroom. There were no guns or knives involved in this operation. My ammunition consisted entirely of data. I arranged 3 encrypted flash drives on the polished wood of my desk. The first drive contained the complete forensic flowchart of Preston Sterling's crumbling commercial real estate Ponzi scheme, tracing every stolen dollar back to his fake shell companies. The second drive held the pristine, high-definition audio recording of Caroline sitting in that upscale coffee shop, arrogantly confessing to federal identity theft and massive credit card fraud. The third and most important drive contained the digitally signed contract from Apex Holdings, proving that I now held the premier legal lien on every single asset the Sterling family claimed to own. I printed out physical copies of the most damning documents, placing them carefully into a thick, black leather portfolio. I wanted tangible proof. I wanted Preston to feel the heavy weight of his own destruction right in his hands. I ran my fingers over the smooth leather, feeling a profound sense of absolute readiness. The trap had been baited perfectly, and the prey was already locked inside the cage. Now I just needed to close the door. My secure mobile phone vibrated on the desk, pulling my attention away from the documents. I picked it up and accepted the encrypted call. It was Arthur, the current director at the Financial Crimes Division in Washington. We did not exchange warm greetings. We were 2 old soldiers coordinating a massive tactical strike. Arthur told me that we were completely green-lit for the operation. His voice was low and extremely serious. He explained that the federal warrants had been signed late last night by a federal judge outside of Wayne County. Preston Sterling's local political connections had absolutely no idea this raid was coming. Arthur confirmed that the local police precincts had been completely blacked out of our communication channels to prevent any corrupt leaks. I nodded, even though he could not see me. I asked him about the tactical deployment. Arthur stated that 24 undercover federal agents were already positioned around the perimeter of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in downtown Detroit. They were parked in unmarked vehicles covering every single exit, including the kitchen loading docks and the underground parking garage. Arthur assured me that nobody was slipping out the back door tonight. He had tactical teams ready to move into the lobby on my command. I looked at the black leather portfolio on my desk and synchronized my watch with his. I told Arthur that Malik and I would enter the gala at exactly 8 in the evening. I told him I needed exactly 20 minutes to take the main stage and present the financial evidence to the wealthy investors in the room. I wanted Preston to be completely stripped of his reputation and his pride before the handcuffs went on his wrists. I told Arthur to breach the heavy mahogany doors of the main ballroom at exactly 8:25. Arthur agreed to the strict timeline. He told me it was an honor to hunt with me one last time. I ended the call and placed the phone in my pocket. The federal hammer was raised and suspended right above Preston's head. Everything was perfectly aligned. I left my study and walked down the quiet hallway to the guest bedroom. I knocked twice and opened the door. Malik was standing near the window looking out at the frozen front yard. For the past 2 weeks, my son had been living in old, faded sweatpants, worn-out construction jeans, and scuffed heavy work boots. He had worn the heavy, tired posture of a man who had lost his home, his company, and his 2 little girls. But today, that defeated, broken man had to die. I walked over to the closet and pulled out 2 thick garment bags that I had specially delivered the night before. I unzipped the canvas, revealing 2 bespoke, perfectly tailored Tom Ford suits. One was a deep midnight blue designed for Malik, and the other was a classic sharp charcoal gray for myself. I handed Malik his suit. I told him to take off the clothes of a victim and put on the armor of a king. Malik looked at the luxurious fabric, his eyes widening slightly. He took the suit and dressed in complete silence. When he finally turned around to face me, the physical transformation was absolutely breathtaking. The custom tailoring broadened his shoulders and forced him to stand incredibly tall. The fine Italian silk and the crisp white shirt erased every single trace of the homeless crying man in a freezing parking lot. He looked wealthy. He looked untouchable. He looked highly dangerous. I put on my own charcoal suit, adjusting the silk tie and sliding a heavy silver watch onto my wrist. I slipped the black leather portfolio into my inner jacket pocket and placed the 3 encrypted flash drives into my breast pocket. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. I did not look like a retired factory worker living on a fixed pension. I looked exactly like the man who had terrified cartel accountants and corrupt billionaires for 3 decades. I turned to my son. I told him that tonight we were not going to beg for his daughters back. We were going to walk into a room full of wolves and remind them exactly who owns the forest. Malik nodded, his jaw set in cold, hard determination. The fear was completely gone from his eyes. We stepped out of the house and walked down the icy driveway. We did not get into my old, battered 15-year-old Chevy Silverado. Waiting for us at the curb with the engine humming softly was a rented, sleek black Maybach. The professional driver stood silently by the rear door, holding it open for us. We slid into the plush leather seats of the luxurious cabin. The heavy doors closed, sealing us in a quiet, soundproof world. As the Maybach glided smoothly through the dark, freezing streets of Detroit, neither of us spoke a single word. We simply watched the city lights blur past the dark-tinted windows. We were 2 soldiers riding into battle, our minds perfectly focused on the precise execution of the mission. The silence between us was heavy and incredibly powerful. The massive luxury vehicle slowed down as we entered the affluent downtown business district. The bright, sparkling lights of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel illuminated the icy street ahead. The Maybach pulled smoothly up to the front entrance, stopping right at the edge of the velvet red carpet. Valets in crisp, clean uniforms rushed forward to open our doors. I stepped out into the freezing night air, feeling the cold winter wind brush against my tailored suit. Malik stepped out beside me, looking up at the towering golden facade of the luxury hotel. Inside that building, Preston and Caroline were celebrating their stolen wealth and laughing at our supposed misery. I buttoned my suit jacket and looked at my son one last time. The war was officially at the front door. I told him it was time to go inside. The air inside the Ritz-Carlton ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the soft clinking of crystal champagne flutes. This was the epicenter of Detroit's white-collar elite, a sanctuary where the city's most ruthless corporate predators gathered to masquerade as generous philanthropists. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the sea of custom-tailored tuxedos and designer evening gowns. Waiters in immaculate white gloves glided silently across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays loaded with imported caviar and top-shelf liquor. At the very front of the room, standing proudly on a brightly lit elevated stage, was Preston Sterling. He held a microphone in one hand and a glass of champagne in the other, soaking up the thunderous applause of the wealthy investors he was actively defrauding. He smiled a wide, arrogant smile, playing the role of the benevolent billionaire savior of the city to absolute perfection. Not far from the stage, standing near a towering ice sculpture, was my former daughter-in-law, Caroline. She was holding court among a circle of high society wives, laughing loudly at a joke someone had just made. She wore a stunning floor-length emerald green gown that clung tightly to her frame, but it was the accessory on her left wrist that caught the light. It was the massive $50,000 diamond watch she had fraudulently purchased using my son's stolen identity. She waved her hand animatedly, making sure the glittering diamonds caught the attention of everyone around her. She looked incredibly comfortable in her stolen luxury, completely convinced that she had successfully ruined my son's life and gotten away with it. They were celebrating a victory built entirely on lies and theft. They were completely unaware that the architect of their destruction was about to walk through the front doors. I watched from the shadows of the antechamber, taking in the sickening display of unearned wealth and arrogant pride. Preston raised his glass to the cheering crowd, offering a toast to his own supposed brilliance. Caroline smiled, radiating a toxic confidence that made me sick to my stomach. They were enjoying the absolute peak of their stolen empire. I looked at my son standing beside me in the dimly lit foyer. Malik was perfectly calm, his broad shoulders set in rigid defiance under the flawless cut of his midnight blue Tom Ford suit. He was no longer the broken, weeping father I had found in that freezing Target parking lot. He was a king returning to reclaim his stolen kingdom. I gave him a single decisive nod. We stepped forward, and the heavy gold-plated double doors of the grand ballroom swung open wide. We did not slip into the room quietly. We walked through the entrance with the heavy, undeniable presence of an incoming storm. The loud, sweeping orchestral music seemed to falter for a fraction of a second. The immediate area around the entrance grew instantly quiet as heads began to turn. We commanded the space simply by existing within it. The energy in the massive room shifted tangibly, rippling outward from the doorway, as conversations abruptly stopped and champagne glasses were lowered. People parted ways, automatically stepping aside to let us pass. Malik walked with a terrifying, regal authority, his eyes locked dead ahead. I walked right beside him, my charcoal gray suit absorbing the chandelier light, my expression carved from solid granite. We moved through the crowd of millionaires and socialites without acknowledging a single one of them. We were looking for the predators. Caroline was the first to see us. She was in the middle of a loud, arrogant laugh when her eyes caught the movement at the back of the room. Her gaze locked onto Malik. The smug smile instantly vanished from her face, completely erased by a sudden, violently intense shock. Her eyes widened in absolute horror as she recognized the man she thought she had left penniless and broken, now looking like absolute royalty. Her manicured fingers went limp. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped from her grasp and shattered loudly against the polished marble floor. The sharp sound of breaking crystal cut through the remaining chatter in the room like a gunshot. The sudden noise drew the attention of the hotel security detail. Within seconds, 6 massive, broad-shouldered security guards in dark suits converged on our position. They moved in a highly coordinated tactical formation, quickly surrounding Malik and me, forming a tight, intimidating physical wall meant to force us backward toward the exit. They crossed their thick arms over their chests, staring down at us with silent hostility. I did not flinch. Malik did not break his stride or alter his icy stare. We stood our ground perfectly still, projecting an aura of total, absolute dominance. Up on the main stage, Preston Sterling finally realized what was causing the massive disruption at the back of his charity gala. He squinted through the bright stage lights and recognized my face. His artificial philanthropic smile contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed his microphone down onto the podium, causing a loud screech of audio feedback to echo through the ballroom. He practically sprinted down the marble steps of the stage, pushing his way through his wealthy investors with zero regard for etiquette. His face was flushing a deep, angry red, the veins in his neck bulging against his expensive silk collar. He marched directly up to the wall of security guards and shoved his way through to stand inches from my face. "What the hell do you think you are doing here?" Preston hissed, his voice trembling with furious indignation. He looked Malik up and down, taking in the expensive tailored suit with visible disgust before turning his venomous glare back to me. "You have absolutely no right to be in this building," he spat. "Get these street thugs out of my hotel right now before I call the police and have you both arrested for criminal trespassing." He gestured aggressively to the head of security, demanding our immediate physical removal. I remained completely still, letting his arrogant, racist words hang heavily in the tense silence of the ballroom. I did not raise my voice. I did not step back. I looked at the security guards who were preparing to lay their hands on my son. I calmly told the head guard that if he touched me or my son, he would be looking for a new career before midnight. The head of security hesitated, catching the absolute, unwavering certainty in my cold tone. Preston grew even more furious, screaming at the guards to do their jobs and throw us out into the freezing street. The commotion had drawn the attention of the hotel general manager, an elegant man who rushed over, desperately trying to prevent a physical altercation from ruining his most prestigious event of the year. "Sir, I must ask you to leave the premises immediately," the general manager said to me, nervously wringing his hands. "This is a private, closed event." I looked past Preston, entirely ignoring his red-faced screaming. I focused my attention strictly on the general manager. I slowly and deliberately reached my right hand into the inner breast pocket of my custom-tailored jacket. Preston's eyes darted to my hand, a brief flash of cowardly panic crossing his face as if he thought I was reaching for a weapon. I was reaching for a weapon, but it was far more devastating than a gun. I pulled out a heavy, solid titanium J.P. Morgan Reserve card. It was a flawless, matte black card issued only to the highest echelon of global wealth, a financial instrument that required tens of millions of dollars in liquid assets just to possess. I extended my arm and handed the heavy metal card directly to the general manager. "Check the name," I instructed, my voice cutting through the noise with chilling authority. The general manager took the heavy titanium card with trembling fingers. He looked down at the engraved silver lettering. He quickly pulled a small digital verification tablet from his jacket and swiped the magnetic strip. The screen flashed a brilliant, undeniable green. The manager's eyes widened in sheer, absolute terror. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking ghostly pale. He immediately snapped his posture straight and bowed his head in deep, profound respect. "Mr. Darius," the manager stammered, his voice shaking with sheer panic. "My profound apologies, sir. I did not realize who you were. Your blind trust is the primary financial backer of this entire hotel property. You own the mortgage on this building." The words fell over the crowd like a heavy iron weight. Preston Sterling froze, completely paralyzed. The arrogant red flush drained entirely from his cheeks, replaced by the cold gray ash of absolute dread. The power in the room had shifted permanently. Preston Sterling stood frozen like a statue of ice. His face was completely drained of all color, his mouth hanging slightly open as the hotel general manager bowed deeply before me in absolute terror. The sudden realization that the retired factory worker he had mercilessly mocked was actually the primary financial backer of the entire Ritz-Carlton property hit him like a violent physical blow to the chest. I did not offer him a single word of explanation. I did not gloat or laugh or even give him the dignity of a glance. I simply walked right past him, leaving him choking on his own ruined arrogance. The 6 massive security guards who had aggressively surrounded us just moments ago now stepped back quickly, clearing a wide path and keeping their heads lowered in absolute submission. I moved through the opulent, crowded ballroom with the calm, graceful stride of a man who owned the very ground he walked on. The heavy premium fabric of my bespoke charcoal gray Tom Ford suit absorbed the bright light from the cascading crystal chandeliers overhead. People in the wealthy crowd began to murmur nervously, stepping back to clear a wide path for me as I approached the front of the room. Men in expensive custom tuxedos and women in $50,000 evening gowns stared in utter confusion and silent awe. They did not know my name, but they could instinctively feel the radiating power. They recognized the terrifying aura of total, absolute control. The grand marble staircase leading up to the main stage loomed ahead of me. I ascended the polished white steps slowly and deliberately, feeling the satisfying click of my leather shoes against the cold stone. Every single step was a testament to the 35 years I spent hunting men exactly like the ones gathered in this room. I reached the top of the platform and walked directly to the center of the stage, passing the decorative floral arrangements and the main crystal podium. I stood incredibly tall, looking out over the sea of Detroit elite. The moment of ultimate reckoning had finally arrived. The ballroom was still filled with the loud, sweeping sounds of the live string orchestra playing in the corner. Hundreds of wealthy guests were still engaged in their arrogant conversations, clinking their champagne flutes and laughing at their own private jokes. I stepped directly up to the tall crystal podium and reached out with my right hand. I tapped the head of the silver microphone twice with my index finger. The sharp, heavy thud echoed through the massive professional sound system, rolling across the vast ballroom like a clap of thunder. The conductor of the string orchestra jumped slightly in surprise, immediately lowering his baton. The violins and the cellos faded into a sudden, abrupt silence. The loud chatter of the crowd died down, instantly replaced by a thick, heavy quiet that blanketed the entire room. 500 millionaires, billionaires, and corrupt corporate politicians all turned their collective attention toward the stage. They looked up, expecting to see Preston Sterling returning to give another hollow speech about his fake philanthropy. Instead, they saw me. They saw a 75-year-old African-American man standing at the center of their exclusive universe, projecting an unshakable, terrifying authority. I looked out over the sea of confused faces, letting the heavy silence stretch out for several long, agonizing seconds. I wanted them to feel the profound discomfort of the unknown. I wanted every single person in that room to focus their eyes entirely on me. I scanned the crowd and saw Caroline standing near the ice sculpture, her face pale, her stolen diamond watch suddenly feeling very heavy on her wrist. The entire room held its breath, waiting for me to speak. I had their absolute, undivided attention. I stood perfectly still, letting the tension build to a breaking point. I leaned forward slightly, resting both of my hands firmly on the edges of the crystal podium. When I finally spoke, I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or show any signs of anger. My voice flowed through the microphone, smooth, deep, and absolutely lethal. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my tone echoing clearly across the massive silent ballroom. "My name is Darius. I know that my presence here tonight comes as a significant surprise to many of you. You were all expecting your generous host Preston Sterling to return to this stage and tell you wonderful, comforting stories about your investments and your charitable contributions. You were expecting to drink expensive champagne and celebrate your massive financial portfolios." I paused for a moment, letting my gaze sweep slowly across the front rows of the audience where the wealthiest investors were seated. "I am not a guest at this charity gala," I continued, my voice dropping to a colder, more dangerous register. "I am not a local politician looking for a generous campaign donation. And I am certainly not a business partner of Preston Sterling. I am something far more significant and far more permanent. I am the man who holds the actual legal paper on everything you see around you. I am the apex predator in a room full of sheep who convinced themselves they were wolves." I let that statement hang heavily in the air, watching the confusion slowly morph into genuine anxiety on the faces of the elite crowd. I know the secrets hidden in your offshore banking accounts. I know the shell companies you use to mask your toxic debts. I have spent my entire life tracking the invisible money that funds rooms exactly like this one. You all came here tonight believing you were untouchable, protected by your wealth and your elite social circles. You believed that because you wear expensive suits and hide behind corporate lawyers, you could manipulate the system forever. But the system has a master, and tonight the master has come to collect. I am not here to ask for your money or your respect. I am here to repossess it." The entire ballroom remained paralyzed, captivated, and terrified by the absolute certainty in my voice. No one dared to speak or even breathe too loudly right now. I lifted my head and looked past the sea of terrified faces toward the back of the massive ballroom. High above the crowd, hidden in the shadows of the balcony, was the audio-visual control booth. Inside that booth sat a young technician whom I had personally paid a very generous sum of cash earlier that afternoon. I caught his eye through the glass window and gave him a single sharp, deliberate nod. The technician immediately went to work flipping a series of heavy switches on his massive soundboard. A deep mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards of the stage as the massive projection equipment powered on. Behind me, 3 gigantic digital screens that spanned the entire length of the ballroom wall suddenly flickered to life. The bright, harsh white light of the projectors illuminated the stage, casting long, imposing shadows across the room. The screens were not displaying the logo of the Sterling Charity Gala anymore. They were connected directly to the encrypted hard drive I had provided to the technician. The crowd gasped collectively as the first image appeared on the massive displays, blindingly clear and undeniable. It was a highly detailed forensic financial flowchart laying bare the deepest, darkest secrets of the man who had organized this entire event. The trap was now fully armed and visually displayed for every single person in the room to see. The silence in the room was replaced by a rising wave of panicked whispers. The truth was finally out. Down on the main floor, the paralyzing shock that had frozen Preston Sterling finally shattered. He looked up at the massive glowing screens behind me and saw his entire fake empire exposed in brilliant high definition. A primal, desperate panic took over his mind. He let out a furious, animalistic scream and tried to charge the stage. He shoved his way past 2 wealthy investors, his face purple with blinding rage, his hands balled into aggressive fists. "Turn that off!" he roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. But before his foot could even touch the first marble step, a tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped directly into his path. It was Malik. My son moved with terrifying speed, planting his feet firmly on the polished floor. Malik physically blocked the staircase, towering over Preston like an impenetrable wall of solid muscle and bespoke tailoring. Preston slammed into him, but my son did not budge a single inch. Malik looked down at the corrupt, broken man who had left his daughters to freeze in a parking lot. Malik did not say a word. He just stared at Preston with a cold, dead, terrifying gaze that promised absolute destruction if Preston took one more step. He waited. I stood at the crystal podium looking out over the sea of wealthy investors and corporate elites. Behind me, the massive digital screens illuminated the dark ballroom with a stark, bright white light. The image projected across the entire wall was not a promotional video for Preston Sterling's charity. It was a highly detailed, comprehensive financial flowchart. It traced every single dollar that had passed through his real estate empire over the last 5 years. I spoke smoothly and clearly into the microphone, letting my voice carry the heavy weight of the truth. I directed their attention to the top of the chart, where the names of their own investment firms and private trusts were listed. I explained exactly how Preston had been soliciting their capital under the guise of funding new commercial developments. Then I guided their eyes down the complex web of red arrows pointing to the offshore shell companies and the phantom limited liability corporations he had created to hide his tracks. I detailed how he was running a classic and incredibly desperate Ponzi scheme. I explained that the money they handed him last quarter did not go into construction or property acquisition. It went directly to paying the overdue interest on loans he had taken out 3 years ago. The escrow accounts he claimed were holding their millions were completely empty. I watched as the realization slowly washed over the audience. The initial shock turned into a suffocating, paralyzing panic. Men in expensive tuxedos pulled out their mobile phones, frantically checking their banking applications. Women gasped, covering their mouths in horror. The quiet murmurs of confusion quickly escalated into a rising tide of angry, panicked voices. Investors who had just clinked champagne glasses with Preston mere minutes ago were now glaring at him with pure, unadulterated hatred. They realized they had been pouring their generational wealth into a bottomless black hole. Preston had robbed the very people sitting in this exact room, and I was displaying the undeniable forensic proof for all of them to see. I let the reality of their financial ruin sink in, giving them a few agonizing moments to understand that the man they thought was a billionaire savior was actually a desperate thief operating on borrowed time. They had trusted him with their futures, and he had gambled it all away. The energy in the room was explosive, a volatile mixture of fear and rage that threatened to tear the elegant gala apart. I raised my hand, calling for their attention once more because the destruction of the Sterling family was only just beginning. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, sleek remote control. I did not need to raise my voice over the growing chaos in the ballroom. I simply pressed a single button. The massive surround sound speakers that had previously played soft classical music now crackled to life with a crisp, clear audio recording. It was the secret audio file my son Malik had captured inside that upscale coffee shop in Birmingham. The arrogant, calculating voice of my daughter-in-law Caroline suddenly echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the Ritz-Carlton. Her voice was amplified, bouncing off the marble pillars, making it absolutely impossible for anyone in the room to ignore. The crowd fell completely silent, listening in stunned disbelief as Caroline proudly confessed to the extortion. They heard her cold, venomous tone as she told Malik that if he signed away his rights to his construction company permanently, she would graciously allow him to see his own daughters every other weekend. They heard her laugh, a cruel, wicked sound, as she openly admitted that her father Preston had planned the entire hostile takeover from the very beginning. She boasted about how incredibly easy it had been to forge Malik's signature on the commercial loan documents because he had trusted her blindly. The wealthy socialites who had been drinking champagne with Caroline just moments ago now stared at her in absolute revulsion. The sweet, innocent single mother facade she had carefully crafted was completely obliterated by her own recorded words. She was exposed not as a victim, but as a ruthless, manipulative financial parasite, perfectly willing to use her own children as bargaining chips to steal an empire. The undeniable audio evidence hung heavy in the air, a damning testament to the pure, rotten core of the Sterling family. She had doomed herself with her own absolute arrogance. While the echoing sound of Caroline's recorded laughter still chilled the ballroom, I pressed the button on my remote a second time. The massive screens behind me shifted instantly. The financial flowchart vanished, replaced by a series of high-definition digital documents. I projected the exact federal credit card applications Caroline had fraudulently submitted. The screens clearly displayed Malik's stolen social security number alongside her own personal digital signature and the specific internet protocol addresses linked directly to her devices. I narrated the evidence, calmly explaining to the horrified audience how she had committed federal identity theft to fund her lavish lifestyle while leaving her husband penniless and her children sleeping in a freezing parking lot. The next slide appeared, showing the itemized luxury receipts from her recent ski trip to Aspen, Colorado. The crowd saw the first-class airline tickets, the five-star resort deposits, and the extravagant dinner bills, all paid for with stolen funds. But I saved the most devastating piece of visual evidence for last. I pressed the button one more time, and the screens filled with a massive, incredibly sharp close-up photograph of a specific piece of jewelry. It was the $50,000 custom diamond watch. I pointed directly at Caroline, who was standing frozen near the ice sculpture. The entire room turned their heads to look at her. The glittering diamonds on the watch she was currently wearing matched the stolen receipt on the screen perfectly. There was nowhere for her to hide. The physical proof of her federal crimes was literally strapped to her own left wrist. The wealthy elites physically stepped away from her, creating a wide, empty circle of shame around her. She looked down at her wrist and then up at the massive screens, her face draining of all color. She grabbed her arm, trying desperately to cover the expensive watch with her other hand, but it was far too late. She was completely exposed, stripped of her fake prestige, and laid bare before the very society she had tried so desperately to impress. The absolute terror in her eyes was a beautiful testament to the precision of my forensic trap. Down on the main floor, Preston Sterling was completely losing his mind. The sight of his crumbling empire and his daughter's exposed crimes pushed him over the edge of sanity. He thrashed against the invisible barrier created by my son's imposing presence. "Turn that off!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysterical desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at the stage, his face purple with rage. "It is a lie. It is all a lie. This is a targeted defamation stunt." He yelled wildly at the hotel staff, demanding that someone unplug the projectors and cut the power to the stage. He threatened to sue everyone in the building, but his hollow threats echoed pointlessly over the angry murmurs of the betrayed investors. Malik stood his ground, completely unbothered by the screaming man, physically blocking him with a cold, terrifying stare that promised absolute violence if Preston took one step closer. I completely ignored Preston's pathetic screaming. He was a cornered rat, lashing out blindly in the final moments before the trap snapped completely shut. I looked out over the chaotic ballroom and raised my remote control one last time. I pressed the final button. The screens behind me flashed bright white before displaying a single massive multi-page legal document. It was the digital contract from Delaware, the Apex Holdings loan agreement. the specific pages highlighting the draconian collateral terms and the immediate forfeiture clause were magnified for everyone to read. At the very bottom of the document, illuminated in glowing green pixels, was the verified digital signature of Preston Sterling. I looked down at the screaming broken man. The final piece of the puzzle was locked into place. The financial execution was complete. I stood at the podium looking down at the man who had tried to destroy my bloodline. The massive digital screens behind me glowed with the undeniable proof of his greed. Preston Sterling stared up at the display, his eyes wide with a frantic denial that was rapidly crumbling into sheer absolute panic. I raised the small remote control in my hand and pressed a single button. The screen zoomed in heavily on the final page of the loan agreement, magnifying the digital ink of his signature until it filled the entire wall. I leaned into the microphone, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom with the cold, heavy weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. Preston, I said slowly and deliberately, ensuring that every single syllable pierced his shattered ego. You thought you could easily discard my family without any repercussions. You thought your money made you invisible to the consequences of your actions. You thought you were outsmarting a faceless corporation when you signed those documents. You thought you were throwing a life raft to your sinking empire by taking $10 million from a mysterious Delaware entity called Apex Holdings. You believed your local political connections and your expensive lawyers could protect you from a default. I paused, letting the silence stretch, letting the anticipation suffocate him. You were wrong, I continued, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. I am Apex Holdings. The collective gasp from the audience was audible, but I did not break eye contact with the broken man below me. I created that shell company specifically for you, I explained. I dangled the exact amount of cash you desperately needed to avoid a federal audit, and you swallowed the hook without a second thought. You signed away your entire life to me. Because you agreed to the immediate cross-collateralization clauses, I now officially hold the premier lien on every single asset connected to your name. I own the mortgage on this very hotel. I own your luxury mansion in the suburbs. I own the stolen construction company you thought you could liquidate. I own the very suit you are wearing tonight. Preston opened his mouth to speak, to protest or beg, but no words came out. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. You thought you could declare bankruptcy and hide behind corporate veils. I said, my tone absolute and merciless. But the contract explicitly stated that any evidence of financial misrepresentation or federal wire fraud would trigger an automatic immediate forfeiture of all assets without the possibility of a grace period. You lied on your initial loan applications, Preston. You defaulted the very second you committed federal wire fraud. You have absolutely nothing left. The heavy silence that had gripped the Ritz-Carlton ballroom instantly shattered. It was as if a massive dam had finally broken under the crushing pressure of the truth. The room erupted into an absolute frenzy of pure chaotic rage. The 500 wealthy investors, socialites, and corporate elites who had just applauded Preston as a benevolent philanthropist now turned on him with the vicious ferocity of betrayed predators. Men in expensive custom tuxedos began shouting at the top of their lungs, their faces flushed red with fury as they realized their generational wealth had been completely wiped out. A prominent local banker hurled his crystal champagne flute directly at the stage. The glass shattered loudly against the marble steps, sending a spray of expensive liquor raining down over Preston's head. Other guests surged forward, abandoning all sense of high society etiquette, screaming demands for their stolen money. The elegant charity gala had degenerated into a volatile mob in a matter of seconds. Preston Sterling collapsed under the overwhelming weight of his total destruction. He stumbled backward, gripping the edge of a linen-covered table to keep from falling to the floor. His breathing became incredibly shallow and erratic. He clutched his chest with a trembling hand, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as a severe panic attack seized his entire body. He gasped for air, his eyes darting wildly around the room looking for a single sympathetic face, but finding absolutely nothing but hatred and disgust. The heavy gold-plated doors of the ballroom remained firmly shut, trapping him inside this luxurious nightmare. He tried to speak to calm the raging crowd, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He was completely surrounded by the people he had mercilessly defrauded, and there was nowhere for him to run. The illusion of his untouchable power was gone, leaving behind only a weak, pathetic man suffocating on the consequences of his own boundless greed. Across the chaotic ballroom, Caroline was experiencing her own private descent into absolute hell. She had retreated until her back hit the cold, ornate wall of the hotel, completely shrinking into herself in sheer, unadulterated terror. The smug, arrogant smile she had worn all evening was permanently erased, replaced by a look of wild, frantic desperation. She looked up at the massive screens that were still displaying the irrefutable evidence of her federal identity theft and her fraudulent credit card applications. She looked down at the $50,000 diamond watch strapped to her wrist. The very symbol of her fake wealth had transformed into the exact physical evidence that would send her to a federal penitentiary. She realized with crushing clarity that she had absolutely no way out. Her father's empire was gone. The stolen money was gone. The political connections that had protected her entire life were completely severed. She was standing in a room full of furious, powerful people with zero cash and zero leverage. She reached out a trembling hand toward a group of women she had considered her closest friends, the same wealthy socialites she had been laughing with just moments before. But as she took a step toward them, they immediately recoiled. They backed away from her with expressions of deep, profound disgust, whispering harsh judgments and turning their backs on her. She was instantly socially excommunicated. She was radioactive, a convicted criminal standing in a stolen designer gown. Caroline slid slowly down the wall, her knees giving out beneath her until she collapsed onto the polished marble floor. She closed her eyes tightly, wishing this was all just a terrible nightmare, but the loud, angry shouting of the betrayed investors forced her to stay awake in her living hell. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around herself as she began to sob uncontrollably. Her perfect world had been entirely dismantled in less than 20 minutes, and she was left sitting in the ruins of her own catastrophic arrogance. Malik stood perfectly still amidst the swirling chaos of the furious crowd. His broad shoulders relaxed, his posture projecting a quiet, immovable strength. He looked down at this woman he had once loved, the woman he had built a home with, and the mother of his two beautiful daughters. He watched Caroline sobbing pathetically on the marble floor. Her expensive dress ruined her social standing, obliterated. Weeks ago, watching her cry would have broken his heart. Days ago, it would have filled him with a burning, vengeful rage. But in this exact moment, looking at her completely stripped of her lies and manipulation, he felt absolutely nothing. The deep burning anger that had consumed him since that freezing night in the Target parking lot had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a profound, chilling emptiness. He did not hate her anymore. He simply pitied her. He saw her not as a powerful enemy, but as a weak, fragile parasite who had destroyed her own life for an illusion. Malik turned his head away from her, completely detaching his soul from her existence. He knew his daughters were safe, and that this toxic woman would never be able to hurt them again. The emotional cord was permanently severed, and he was finally free. The shouting of the angry investors continued to echo through the massive, vaulted ceilings of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom, creating a deafening, chaotic roar. Men were demanding arrests, and women were crying over their lost fortunes. But cutting straight through the heavy noise of the panicked crowd, a new distinct sound began to pierce the freezing Detroit night air. It started as a distant wail echoing off the tall glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. The sound grew rapidly louder, more urgent, and incredibly commanding. It was the unmistakable heavy wail of federal law enforcement sirens approaching the hotel from every possible direction. The flashing red and blue emergency lights began to reflect brightly against the tall floor-to-ceiling windows of the grand ballroom, signaling the absolute end. There would be no escape for Preston or Caroline tonight. The trap had closed, and the consequences had finally arrived. The deafening wail of the approaching sirens reached an absolute crescendo, vibrating through the thick glass windows of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom. The panicked shouting of the betrayed investors was suddenly drowned out by a massive, thunderous crash. The towering, heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom were violently kicked open. They slammed against the ornate walls with a force that shook the crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. A flood of federal authority poured into the opulent space. 24 federal agents stormed the event, moving with terrifying, synchronized precision. They wore dark tactical gear, heavy Kevlar vests, and thick windbreakers with the letters FBI printed in bright, bold yellow across their backs and chests. They flooded the marble floors, fanning out rapidly to secure every single exit, locking down the entire perimeter so that not a single corrupt investor or terrified socialite could escape the room. The sheer overwhelming force of the United States government had just crashed the most exclusive party in Detroit. The wealthy elites who had been screaming and throwing drinks just moments before now froze in absolute terrified silence, stepping back and raising their hands in sheer panic. Walking straight through the middle of the tactical formation was Arthur, the current director of the Financial Crimes Division, and my old trusted friend. He did not run or rush. He walked with the slow, heavy, measured stride of a man who held absolute supreme authority over every single person in that room. His face was carved from stone, projecting a cold, ruthless focus. The sea of millionaires and billionaires parted instantly before him, too terrified to even breathe in his direction. Arthur kept his eyes locked dead ahead, entirely ignoring the panicked crowd around him. He marched directly toward the main stage, where the remnants of the Sterling Empire were completely falling apart. Arthur ascended the marble steps of the stage without breaking his commanding stride. He walked straight up to Preston Sterling, who was still clutching his chest and gasping for air in the center of the platform. Preston looked up at the federal director, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate kind of terror. He opened his mouth, trying to formulate a defense, trying to use his political connections or his fake wealth to buy his way out of the inevitable. But Arthur did not give him the chance to speak a single word. Two massive tactical agents flanked Preston, grabbing his arms with uncompromising force and twisting them roughly behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping tightly onto Preston Sterling's wrists echoed through the microphone that still sat on the crystal podium. It was the absolute final sound of his total destruction, broadcast clearly to every single one of his wealthy peers. Arthur stepped forward, standing inches from Preston's sweating face, and read the federal charges in a loud, booming voice that filled every corner of the massive ballroom. Preston Sterling, you are under federal arrest, Arthur declared, his voice echoing off the walls. You are being charged with multiple counts of interstate wire fraud, aggressive money laundering, corporate racketeering, and federal extortion. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you use it. Preston completely broke down. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire real estate mogul completely vanished. His knees buckled beneath him, and he began to weep uncontrollably, exactly like a terrified, helpless child. He sobbed loudly, begging for his lawyers, pleading with the agents that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. The tactical agents did not show a single ounce of mercy or hesitation. They hauled Preston to his feet and dragged him roughly across the stage, pulling the weeping, broken man through the sea of disgusted investors who watched his humiliating downfall in absolute silence. Across the ballroom, Caroline watched the complete and total destruction of her father. She stood paralyzed against the ornate wall, her eyes wide with a horror so profound it seemed to stop her heart from beating. The impenetrable, arrogant facade she had worn her entire life completely shattered into a million tiny, unrecoverable pieces. The realization that the federal agents were not just there for her father, but were actively securing the room to arrest her as well, washed over her in a suffocating wave of panic. She looked around wildly, realizing she had absolutely no money, no power, and no friends left in the world to protect her. Her frantic, desperate eyes darted across the crowd until they finally locked onto my son. Malik was standing near the edge of the stage, his posture perfectly straight, his expression displaying a quiet, immovable strength. A wild, hysterical delusion took over Caroline's mind. She believed she could still use her tears to manipulate the man she had brutally discarded. She lunged away from the wall and sprinted across the marble floor, running directly toward Malik. She threw herself forward, dropping heavily to her knees right at his feet. The sudden violent impact completely ruined her $100,000 designer gown, tearing the expensive emerald silk and scraping her bare skin against the hard, cold floor. She did not care about the dress anymore. She sobbed hysterically, her chest heaving as she grabbed desperately at the fabric of Malik's tailored suit pants. "Malik, please," she screamed, her voice cracking with raw, unadulterated terror. "You have to help me. You have to stop them. My dad made me do it all. I had absolutely no choice. He forced me to forge the papers and take the money. I never wanted to hurt you. I still love you, Malik. Please think of our beautiful girls. Think of Nia and Aaliyah. They need their mother. Do not let them take me away to a federal prison." She wept openly, begging and pleading, trying to use the innocent children she had allowed to suffer as a physical shield against her own federal crimes. Malik did not step back, and he did not reach down to help her up. He stood perfectly still, looking down at the sobbing, pathetic woman gripping his legs. Just a few short weeks ago, seeing the mother of his children crying on the floor would have shattered his soul. Just a few days ago, it would have filled his chest with a burning, vengeful fire. But standing there in that opulent ballroom, surrounded by federal agents and ruined millionaires, Malik felt absolutely nothing. The deep, burning anger had completely evaporated, leaving behind a profound, chilling emptiness. He looked at Caroline and saw right through her desperate performance. He saw a ruthless financial parasite who had willingly destroyed her own family to maintain an illusion of wealth. He saw the woman who had happily stolen his entire life. Malik slowly reached down and firmly peeled her trembling fingers off his suit. He looked directly into her terrified, weeping eyes, his voice utterly devoid of any emotion or pity. "You let my daughters freeze in a dark parking lot," Malik said, his words falling like heavy blocks of ice. "You are dead to me." Before Caroline could let out another desperate plea, two female federal agents stepped forward from the tactical formation. They moved with swift, uncompromising efficiency. They grabbed Caroline roughly by both of her arms, hoisting her forcefully up from the marble floor. Caroline screamed, thrashing wildly against their firm grips, but the agents easily overpowered her. One of the female agents quickly reached out and unclipped the massive $50,000 diamond watch from Caroline's left wrist, dropping the stolen jewelry directly into a clear plastic federal evidence bag. The sharp metallic snap of handcuffs locking tightly around Caroline's wrists cut off her frantic apologies. "You are under arrest for identity theft and interstate credit card fraud," the agent stated coldly. Caroline wailed hysterically, screaming Malik's name over and over again as the agents turned her around and marched her toward the exit. She was dragged out through the heavy gold-plated doors of the Ritz-Carlton, her desperate cries echoing down the long hotel corridors until she was pushed violently out into the freezing dark and unforgiving Detroit winter night. 6 months have passed since that freezing winter night when my son and granddaughters were forced to sleep in a dark parking lot. The wheels of federal justice turn slowly, but when they finally crush you, they leave absolutely nothing behind. The aftermath of the Ritz-Carlton raid was a swift and brutal execution of the law. Preston Sterling, the man who believed his political connections and fake wealth made him untouchable, stood before a federal judge and was sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There were no country club prisons for him. His vast fraudulent empire was completely dismantled piece by piece to pay back the investors he had so ruthlessly robbed. Caroline realized very quickly that her arrogant tears held absolutely no currency in a federal courtroom. Faced with a mountain of undeniable digital evidence detailing her identity theft and interstate credit card fraud, she broke down and accepted a desperate plea deal. She was sentenced to 5 years in a federal facility, stripped of her designer clothes and her diamond watches. Because both Preston and Caroline were now convicted federal felons, the corrupt family court rulings were immediately overturned. Malik stood before a new judge and was instantly granted full sole and undisputed custody of Nia and Aaliyah. The nightmare of losing his children was permanently erased, and the deep, agonizing fear that had haunted his eyes was finally replaced by a profound, unwavering peace. With the toxic parasites permanently removed from our lives, Malik was able to fully reclaim the empire he had built with his own 2 hands. The fraudulent commercial loans and the forged asset transfers were legally nullified, returning his rightful ownership of the construction company and the 4-bedroom suburban house he had worked so hard to buy. But we did not just restore his business, we completely supercharged it. I unlocked a portion of my $12 million blind trust, injecting his company with a massive wave of clean, untraceable capital. Malik did not use this new wealth to buy flashy sports cars or build vanity projects. He remembered the freezing cold of that parking lot and channeled his resources into something that truly mattered. He pivoted his entire commercial operation, focusing heavily on acquiring and rebuilding abandoned properties in underprivileged Detroit neighborhoods. He transformed crumbling empty buildings into state-of-the-art community centers, safe havens, where families could find warmth, education, and support. His company became a pillar of the city, a shining example of what happens when true power is wielded with genuine compassion instead of hollow greed. He worked long, hard hours, but he no longer worked with the desperate anxiety of a man trying to appease an ungrateful wife. He worked with the proud, confident stride of a king, securing a beautiful, lasting legacy for his 2 daughters. Despite the massive scale of my now revealed wealth, I did not change a single thing about my own daily life. I did not move into a towering penthouse or purchase a fleet of luxury vehicles. I still live in my modest 15-year-old house in the exact same quiet neighborhood. I still drive my reliable battered Chevy Silverado, and I still wear my faded flannel shirts and comfortable worn-out boots. My neighbors still wave to me, assuming I am just a quiet, retired factory worker living on a fixed pension. I let them believe whatever they want to believe. True wealth has absolutely nothing to do with showing off expensive brands or seeking validation from strangers. True wealth is the silent, absolute power to completely protect your bloodline from anyone who dares to threaten it. It is the ability to drop a financial nuclear bomb on your enemies without ever raising your voice. Preston and Caroline chased the illusion of power, and it led them straight into a concrete cell. I hold the reality of power, and it allows me to sleep perfectly soundly every single night knowing my family is safe. It is a remarkably warm summer evening in Detroit. The harsh, bitter winter that tested our souls has completely melted away, leaving behind a vibrant, blooming city. I am sitting on my front porch in my favorite wooden rocking chair, holding a heavy crystal glass filled with neat aged bourbon. The golden sunset casts a warm, peaceful glow over the quiet neighborhood. Out in the driveway, Malik is laughing loudly, a deep, joyful sound that fills the evening air. He is jogging alongside Nia and Aaliyah, holding the back of their seats as he teaches them how to ride their new bicycles without training wheels. The girls are giggling, their faces lit up with pure, innocent joy as they pedal forward. There are no more tears, no more manipulative threats, and no more freezing nights. Perfect, absolute order has been restored to our universe. I take a slow, smooth sip of my bourbon, feeling the familiar warmth settle deep into my chest. I look out at the world and smile a quiet, knowing smile. They looked at an old black man with calloused hands and faded clothes, and they saw a helpless victim. They looked at a loving, hard-working father and saw an easy target to exploit. But they forgot the oldest, most fundamental rule of the wild. The most dangerous lion is not the one roaring loudly on the mountaintop begging for attention. It is the one waiting silently in the tall grass, watching, observing, and calculating every single move before it strikes with lethal precision. When the predators came for my blood, they thought they were bringing a storm that would wash us away. But we did not just survive their storm. We became the lightning. We owned the sky. The greatest lesson we can take from this story is that true wealth is never measured by the designer clothes you wear or the luxury cars you drive. Real power is absolutely silent. When people are entirely driven by greed and toxic arrogance, they blind themselves to the quiet strength of the very people they underestimate. You should never mistake a person's quiet kindness for weakness or their humble silence for ignorance. The world is full of individuals who may look completely ordinary on the outside but possess the fierce resilience and hidden resources to protect what matters most. Build your life and your family on honesty and hard work, because any empire built on lies and manipulation will eventually collapse under the crushing weight of the truth. If this story of justice and family resilience resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more powerful life lessons just like this one.